At my daughter's funeral, as the first shovel of dirt hit her casket, my son-in-law leaned in and whispered that I had 1 week to pack my bags. I simply nodded, grabbed my things, and walked away. 2 weeks later, the FBI kicked his custom oak door off its hinges. My name is Maurice. I am 69 years old. I spent my entire life building homes with my bare hands, only to find myself homeless on the day I buried my only child. Before I tell you how I dismantled a parasite's life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting an old man is the most dangerous game a coward can play. The cemetery air was heavy with the smell of wet soil and wilting lilies. I stood there, a 69-year-old black man staring down into the dark earth where my Camille rested. The mahogany casket looked entirely too small. The priest was still muttering his final prayer when Bradley, my white son-in-law, stepped uncomfortably close to my side. He did not offer a hand of comfort. He did not shed a single tear. He simply adjusted the collar of his expensive Italian suit and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You have 1 week to get your trash out of the house, Maurice. Vanessa does not like the smell of old people." He smiled a thin, bloodless smile. I turned my head slowly to look at him. Vanessa was the woman he had been seeing while my daughter lay dying in a hospital bed. He had brought her to the funeral. She stood near the black limousines, checking her phone and chewing gum. I did not yell. I did not raise my hand to strike him, though every callus on my palms burned with the urge to do so. I just looked back at the grave. 1 week, Bradley repeated, patting my shoulder as if I were a stray dog. Then he turned and walked back to his mistress, leaving me alone by the open hole in the ground. I stayed until the gravediggers finished their job. When the final patch of grass was laid, I walked the 3 miles back to the house. I did not get 1 week. I did not even get 1 hour. When I arrived at the property, the cold reality of my situation was scattered across the front lawn. 2 large trash bags and an old leather suitcase sat sinking into the muddy grass. My clothes, my work boots, and a framed photograph of Camille were tossed carelessly on top of the pile. The front door was dead-bolted. The locks had already been changed. I stood on the sidewalk and stared at the 2-story brick house. I knew every inch of that house because I paid for it. 40 years of laying concrete, breathing in drywall dust, and destroying my knees went into buying that property. I had purchased it in cash. But I put the deed in Camille's name to give her and my grandson Leo a solid foundation, a legal shield against inheritance taxes. I trusted her, and by extension, I had tolerated him. Now Bradley stood behind the living room window. He held a glass of scotch in one hand and raised it toward me in a mocking toast. Vanessa walked up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and laughing at something he said. They were standing in the living room I had painted, drinking from glasses I had bought, celebrating the death of my child. A sharp pain bloomed in my chest. I walked over to the mud and picked up the framed photograph of my daughter. The glass was cracked straight down the middle, dividing her smiling face in two. I wiped the dirt from the frame with my thumb. The injustice of it all tasted like ash in my mouth. He was legally in the right. He was Camille's husband. Without a will explicitly stating otherwise, the state recognized him as the sole heir to her estate. He owned the bricks. He owned the roof. He owned the right to throw me into the street. I gathered my bags in silence. I did not pound on the door. I did not beg. I loaded my damp belongings into the back of my rusted pickup truck. I turned the ignition, listening to the engine struggle before it finally roared to life. I drove away without looking back at the window. The rain started pouring as I pulled into the parking lot of a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting a sickly red glow over the wet asphalt. I was exhausted. My bones ached from the damp cold, and my mind was numb from the sheer weight of the day. All I wanted was a hot shower and a bed where I could finally allow myself to mourn my daughter. I walked into the cramped lobby, my boots squeaking on the linoleum floor. The clerk behind the plexiglass window looked up from his magazine with supreme disinterest. I asked for a single room for 3 nights. I handed him my debit card. I knew exactly how much money was in that account. $80,000. It was my entire life savings, the retirement fund I had built over 4 decades of breaking my back in the sun. It was supposed to be my safety net. The clerk swiped the card. The machine beeped a harsh, flat tone. Declined. The clerk sighed and swiped it again. Same harsh beep. He slid the card back under the glass gap, telling me I needed an alternate form of payment. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I told him there must be a mistake. I took out my phone and opened the banking application. My hands shook slightly as I typed in my password. The screen loaded, displaying the blue and white logo of the bank. Then the numbers appeared. Available balance $0.00. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. I tapped on the transaction history. The list populated instantly. Yesterday afternoon, exactly 4 hours after Camille's heart stopped beating, a single wire transfer had drained the entire account. The destination account belonged to a private wealth management firm, Bradley's firm. 2 months ago, when Camille slipped into a coma, Bradley had begged me to add his name to my account as a joint signer. He claimed he needed quick access to funds to pay for her emergency medical treatments and specialized care. He cried. He swore he would handle the paperwork so I could focus on holding my daughter's hand. I gave him the authorization. He never paid a single hospital bill. He waited until she was dead and took everything. I stood in the motel lobby with a worthless piece of plastic in my hand. I had no house. I had no money. I had nowhere to go. I walked back out into the freezing rain and climbed into my truck. I sat behind the steering wheel, shivering in the dark. I reached into the pocket of my damp coat to find my keys. Instead, my fingers brushed against cold metal. It was a small brass key with a number stamped on it. I pulled it out and held it up to the street lamp. Number 402. Camille had pressed it into my palm 3 days before she lost consciousness. She had told me it was just a spare key to her gym locker, but the urgency in her feverish eyes had told a different story. I looked at the key, then down at my empty bank account. Bradley thought he had crushed me. He thought he had stripped a foolish old man of all his armor. He did not realize he had just set me completely free. I started the engine and put the truck in drive. The silent adjustment had begun. The neon lights of the motel sign buzzed and flickered above my rusted pickup truck. I had spent the night shivering in the driver's seat, my 69-year-old bones aching from the damp cold. Sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Bradley standing in my living room raising a glass of scotch to my ruined life. As the first light of dawn broke through the gray clouds, I reached into the pocket of my heavy work coat and pulled out the small brass key. Number 402. Camille had slipped it into my hand just days before her organs began to fail. I started the engine and drove toward the downtown bus terminal. The terminal was a depressing concrete structure that smelled of stale tobacco and wet asphalt. I walked past the sleeping drifters and found a wall of rusted metal lockers near the rear exit. I inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a harsh metallic scrape. I pulled the door open. Inside, sitting alone in the dark, was a yellow padded envelope. I tore the envelope open with rough hands. A standard black USB drive fell into my palm, followed by a piece of hotel stationery. The handwriting on the paper was jagged and uneven, written by someone whose fingers were trembling uncontrollably. It was Camille's handwriting. The note contained only 6 words. Do not let him take Leo. My blood ran completely cold. I folded the note and shoved it into my pocket alongside the drive. I did not know what was on the USB, but the sheer terror in my daughter's final message overrode everything else. I needed to see my 8-year-old grandson. I needed to know he was safe from the man who had just thrown me onto the street. I drove my truck straight to Oak Ridge Elementary. The morning bell had just rung and the manicured lawns were empty. I walked into the main office, taking off my worn canvas hat. Before I could even approach the receptionist to ask for Leo, a heavy hand clamped down on my right shoulder. I turned around to find Bradley standing there. He was wearing another immaculate tailored suit, holding a leather briefcase in one hand and gripping Leo's small wrist tightly with the other. Leo looked pale and exhausted, his eyes red and swollen from crying. Grandpa Leo whispered, trying to pull his arm away. Bradley yanked the boy closer to his leg with a violent jerk. "What are you doing here?" "Maurice," Bradley asked, his voice dripping with fake concern for the benefit of the school staff watching us. "I told him I came to check on my grandson." Bradley chuckled softly, a sound that made my stomach turn. "You are trespassing," he said smoothly, "and you are wasting your time. Leo is not a student here anymore." I demanded to know what he was talking about. Bradley leaned in closer, dropping his friendly facade completely. His breath smelled of expensive peppermint and stale coffee. "I am sending him to a private boarding school on the West Coast," he whispered, 1,000 miles away from you. "He leaves tonight." I felt my fists clench so hard my fingernails dug into my palms. I told him he could not afford a school like that. He laughed right in my face, his eyes shining with pure arrogance. "Oh, but I can, Maurice. Camille's life insurance policy cleared this morning. $500,000 deposited directly into my personal account. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and shoved it against my chest. It was a photocopy of a beneficiary change form. I looked at the date. The date of the signature was October 14th. It was the exact day Camille had slipped into her final irreversible coma. The signature at the bottom was a shaky, pathetic forgery. He had forged her name while she was dying, hooked up to a ventilator. I looked up at him, the rage boiling in my veins. "You forged this," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Prove it," he sneered, leaning back. "Handwriting experts cost thousands of dollars, Maurice. And you do not even have enough money to buy a cup of black coffee." He turned his back on me, dragging my crying grandson out the double-glass doors. I stood in the school office, paralyzed by the absolute lack of power I possessed. I had no money. I had no home. And now I was losing the only piece of my daughter I had left. I walked out to my truck, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I remembered the black USB drive. I drove directly to the public library across town. I sat at a scratched wooden desk in the corner and plugged the drive into a public computer. A password prompt immediately flashed on the screen. I closed my eyes, trying to think like my daughter. I typed in the name of the golden retriever she loved as a little girl, followed by the year she was born. Buster, 1991. I hit enter. The screen unlocked. The drive contained dozens of hidden folders. There were credit card statements showing massive charges to luxury boutiques. There were bank transfers to offshore accounts. But one specific file stood out. It was an audio recording saved just 3 days before she went into the hospital. I put on the cheap plastic headphones provided by the library and pressed play. There was a loud rustling sound followed by heavy, labored breathing. Then I heard Camille's voice. It was weak, fragile, and absolutely terrified. "Dad," she whispered into the microphone, "if you are hearing this, something is terribly wrong. Bradley told the doctors to change my pain medication. He said it was for the best, but I am in agony. My chest burns all the time. I saw him switching the pills in my daily organizer when he thought I was asleep. I am so scared. Please, Dad, protect Leo." The recording clicked off. I sat in the silent library, the blood rushing to my ears, my heart pounding against my ribs. He had not just stolen her money. He had tortured her. He had intentionally hastened her death to cash out her life insurance and take the house. I pulled the drive from the computer and drove straight to the police precinct. I marched inside and slammed the USB onto the metal desk of a tired-looking detective. I told him my son-in-law had forged legal documents and tampered with my daughter's medication. I demanded he listen to the recording. The detective plugged it in and listened, his face completely impassive. When the audio finished, he handed the drive back to me with a sigh. He told me the evidence was entirely circumstantial. He said a dying woman on heavy narcotics could easily be confused or hallucinating. He stated that the recording proved nothing without physical medical evidence, which no longer existed because Camille had been cremated. He said the insurance company had already verified the signature with their own internal team. They were not going to open a homicide investigation based on the paranoid ramblings of a grieving father. I demanded he do his job. I raised my voice, slamming my fist on the desk. 2 uniformed officers immediately stepped forward, placing their hands heavily on their duty belts. I was physically escorted out of the precinct. As I stood on the concrete steps, breathing in the cold city air and trying to calm my racing heart, a patrol car pulled up to the curb. A sheriff's deputy stepped out, holding a thick yellow envelope. He walked up the steps and asked if I was Maurice Hayes. I nodded slowly. He handed me the envelope. "You have been served," he said coldly, turning around and getting back into his car. I opened the flap and pulled out the stack of legal documents. It was an emergency restraining order. Bradley had filed it just an hour ago. He claimed I had violently threatened him at the elementary school, that I was mentally unstable, and that I posed a severe physical danger to his family. A judge had already signed it based on his polished lies. I was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of Bradley, Vanessa, or my grandson Leo. Any violation would result in my immediate arrest and imprisonment. I stood on the steps of the police station holding the piece of paper that stripped me of my final rights as a grandfather and a father. The law was perfectly protecting the parasite. If I took one single step toward him, I would die in a prison cell, and he would win everything. I folded the paper carefully and slid it into my pocket. I realized then that playing by their rules would only get me buried in the dirt next to my daughter. I needed to find a different kind of justice. I needed a weapon he could not see coming. I sat in the cab of my truck listening to the heavy rain hammer against the rusted metal roof. The restraining order sat on the passenger seat, a crisp white piece of paper that legally bound my hands and silenced my voice. If I drove back to my own house to confront Bradley, the police would arrest me before I even reached the front porch. The system was designed to protect men in expensive suits regardless of the blood on their hands. I realized that if I tried to fight him with brute force or righteous anger, I would lose. I needed someone who knew how to fight in the shadows. I needed a man who understood the intricate, dirty plumbing of corporate law. I put the truck in gear and drove to a dilapidated strip mall on the industrial edge of the city. The neon sign above the corner office flickered weakly against the gray sky. It read, "Richard Gable, Attorney at Law." The letter A was burnt out. Richard was a man who had lost his license 5 years ago for digging too deep into a massive corporate embezzlement scheme and publicly humiliating a powerful judge. He eventually got his license back, but he lost his pristine corner office, his wealthy corporate clients, and his reputation in polite society. He was bitter sharp and entirely disillusioned with the concept of blind justice. He was exactly the kind of stray dog I needed. I walked into his office. The air smelled faintly of stale tobacco, old paper, and cheap black coffee. Richard looked up from behind a desk buried under mountains of disorganized case files. He was a man in his late 50s with dark circles under his eyes, a loosened necktie, and sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked annoyed by the interruption. I did not introduce myself. I walked straight to his desk and dropped the restraining order. The padded yellow envelope, the USB drive, and my empty bank statements right on top of his paperwork. I told him my son-in-law had murdered my daughter, stolen my life savings, kidnapped my grandson, and legally banished me from my own property. I told him the local police had thrown me out of the precinct. Richard stared at me for a long moment. He did not offer me a hollow apology. He did not tell me everything was going to be all right. He simply picked up the USB drive, plugged it into his heavy, outdated computer monitor, and pointed to a cracked leather chair. He told me to sit down and shut up. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the office was the aggressive clicking of Richard striking his keyboard. I watched his eyes dart across the screen as he opened the hidden folders Camille had left behind. When he clicked on the audio file, the fragile, terrified voice of my daughter filled the small room. She spoke about the agonizing pain, the switched medications, and her sheer terror of her own husband. I forced myself to look at the wall. I refused to break down. Richard listened to the recording twice. His expression remained entirely neutral, but a hard, dangerous light ignited in his eyes. When the audio finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Richard told me the police were lazy, but from a strictly legal standpoint, they were correct. He explained that without a toxicology report or physical medical evidence, a defense attorney would tear the recording apart in 10 minutes. They would claim Camille was suffering from narcotic-induced paranoia. Bradley had ensured she was cremated within 48 hours of her death, completely destroying the physical evidence of his crime. Richard stated that we could not pursue a murder charge, but Richard was not a criminal prosecutor. He was a financial bulldog. He turned his computer monitor toward me and pointed a stained finger at the screen. He told me to forget the murder for a moment and follow the money. Bradley did not simply take the $500,000 from the life insurance policy and stuff it under a mattress. Richard explained that men like Bradley were driven by a desperate need to appear superior. They did not just want to be rich, they wanted to be powerful. Richard had traced the routing numbers from my drained bank account and the insurance payout. Bradley had moved the entire sum through 2 offshore shell companies in the Caribbean to wash the origin of the funds. Then he had deposited the clean money into a newly formed domestic limited liability company. The company was named Foster Holdings. Bradley was using my daughter's blood money as a down payment to purchase a massive multi-million-dollar commercial retail complex in the downtown financial district. He was trying to instantly transform himself into a real estate mogul. I stared at the screen, the anger in my chest hardening into something cold and tactical. But Richard was not finished. He typed furiously, pulling up county property tax records and municipal zoning files. He told me that $500,000 was nowhere near enough to secure a commercial property of that magnitude. To get the massive commercial loan approved, Bradley needed collateral. He needed to show the bank a physical asset of equal value. Richard clicked on a newly filed loan document and expanded the image. On the screen was a property deed to a 5-acre plot of industrial land near the riverbank. It was a barren, weed-infested piece of dirt I had purchased 30 years ago, hoping the city would expand in that direction. The city never did, and the land just sat there accumulating dead grass and minor property taxes. It was entirely in my name. I had almost forgotten I owned it. Richard pointed to the second page of the document. 3 days ago, someone had leveraged that exact piece of land to secure a $1 million business loan for Foster Holdings. I leaned in my eyes, scanning the digital document. At the bottom of the page, right next to the official blue stamp of a public notary, was my signature. I told Richard I had not signed a single legal document in over a year. Bradley had forged my name again. He had used his polished charm and a heavily bribed notary to steal my forgotten land and fund his empire. Richard grabbed his desk phone, his face lighting up with the pure thrill of the hunt. He told me we had him dead to rights. He said we could call the federal bank fraud department right this second, invalidate the commercial loan, and have Bradley arrested for federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft by tomorrow morning. I reached across the desk and slammed my heavy hand down on the receiver, instantly cutting off the dial tone. Richard looked at me, completely stunned by my reaction. I looked him dead in the eyes. I told him no. If we have him arrested right now, the bank freezes the deal. Bradley hires a slick defense attorney, pleads down to a white-collar charge, and spends 3 years playing tennis in a minimum security federal camp. While he is inside, the remaining money sits safely hidden in his offshore accounts, waiting for his release. He still wins. I told Richard I did not want Bradley arrested today. I wanted him destroyed entirely. If you shoot a bird while it is sitting on the ground, it just falls over. But if you let it fly as high as it can go before you pull the trigger, the impact of the fall will break every single bone in its body. I wanted Bradley to sign the final closing papers on that commercial property. I wanted him to transfer every stolen dime he had into that deal. I wanted him standing on the very top of his fragile house of cards, feeling like the king of the world before I struck the match and burned it to the ground. Richard slowly took his hand off the phone. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. He leaned forward and asked me what my first move was. Before I could answer, my cell phone vibrated violently in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was an automated fraud alert from my primary credit card company. This was not the debit account Bradley had drained, but my oldest credit line, one I rarely used. I opened the notification on my screen. A charge for $12,000 had just been approved at a high-end interior design boutique. In his arrogant rush to steal my life savings, Bradley had forgotten to cancel my access to the online dashboard of my own credit account. I logged into the application and watched the pending charges update in real time. $5,000 for a crystal chandelier. $7,000 for Italian leather sofas. Vanessa, his mistress, was currently walking through a luxury showroom buying furniture to fill the house I built. She was redecorating my dead daughter's home using my credit. I looked up at Richard. I showed him the screen. I told him we needed to go shopping. Richard slammed his hand flat against the cluttered wooden desk, rattling a cold cup of black coffee and scattering loose paper clips. He pointed a stained finger directly at my chest, loudly reminding me of the legal bear trap I was currently standing in. The judge had signed a 500-foot restraining order against me just a few hours ago. If I drove my truck down to that luxury interior design boutique to confront Vanessa, Bradley would have city patrol cars swarming the building before I could even open my mouth. I would be arrested for violating a direct court order, thrown into a holding cell, and permanently labeled as a violent, unstable old man. The police would never look at my evidence. They would only see a criminal. I stared at the glowing computer screen in Richard's dim office. The red notification icon was still flashing in the corner, boldly announcing a pending charge of $12,000. I realized I did not need to physically walk into that showroom to catch a thief. My days of using my fists to solve problems were over. I sat back down in the cracked leather chair and told Richard to ignore the boutique location. I told him to pull up the full billing history for the past 30 days. If Vanessa was arrogant enough to drop $12,000 on a crystal chandelier in broad daylight, she had undoubtedly been testing the waters earlier. Richard cracked his knuckles. His fingers flew across the sticky keyboard. He bypassed the basic consumer dashboard and accessed the detailed merchant ledger provided by the bank. The screen instantly populated with a long, sickening list of transactions. Vanessa had been incredibly busy while I was sitting in a hospital room watching my daughter fade away. There was a charge for $3,000 at a luxury day spa. There was a bill for $400 at an upscale seafood restaurant dated the exact evening Camille was pronounced dead. There was a transaction for $2,000 at a designer luggage store. She was treating my credit line like her own personal lottery ticket. She was building her new glamorous life using the financial foundation I had spent decades constructing. When Camille went into the hospital, I had handed Bradley a stack of mail, including a replacement credit card I had not yet activated. I trusted him to hold my mail and pay the utility bills. Instead, he activated the card and handed it to his mistress, treating my pristine credit history as his personal slush fund. I stared at the 16-digit account number displayed at the top of the monitor. I knew every single number by heart. I opened that exact credit account 32 years ago. I was working 3 separate contracting jobs at the time. I spent my summers pouring boiling asphalt on the state highways and my winters framing houses in the freezing snow. I opened that line of credit for one specific reason. Camille had just been accepted into a prestigious university out of state. My cash savings from the construction sites were not quite enough to cover her first semester tuition and her dormitory fees. I used that card to pay for her education so she would never have to take out a crippling student loan. I spent 5 years paying off that balance. I worked every weekend. I wore the same pair of heavy work boots until the soles completely detached and I had to duct tape them together just to walk. I skipped lunches. I never took a single vacation. And I did it all gladly. Every drop of sweat, every aching muscle was an investment in my daughter's future. When she walked across that graduation stage, debt-free and smiling, I felt like the richest man in the entire world. Now this arrogant woman, the mistress who had slept in my son-in-law's bed while my child lay dying in a sterile hospital room, was using that same sacred account to buy Italian leather sofas and silk bed sheets. The sheer disrespect was a physical weight pressing against my chest, threatening to crack my ribs. Richard hovered his mouse cursor over the red button on the screen that read, "Freeze account." He looked over at me, waiting for the command to shut off the money supply and report the card as stolen. I shook my head slowly. I told him to leave it open. Let the transaction clear. Richard looked at me as if I had lost my mind. He warned me that if I did not report the fraud immediately, the credit card company would hold me personally liable for the massive balance. I would owe the bank $12,000 that I simply did not have. I told him I did not care about the balance right now. In this state, any fraudulent credit card purchase over $2,000 is automatically classified as a felony. Grand larceny. By letting the charge clear, we were allowing Vanessa to commit a major crime on a recorded, undeniable digital ledger. We were letting her weave her own noose. If I canceled it right now, it was merely an attempted fraud, a slap on the wrist. If the expensive furniture was officially delivered to her, it was a guaranteed prison sentence. Richard smiled, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. He understood the strategy perfectly. He moved the mouse away from the freeze button. But as Richard scrolled further down the list of transactions, moving past the spa treatments and the expensive dinners, his cursor suddenly stopped. The steady clicking of his mouse ceased entirely. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing at a specific line of text buried in the middle of the statement. There was a charge for $850. It did not match the pattern of luxury shopping or fine dining. The merchant name was listed as Apex Wellness Concierge. The date of the transaction was October 10th. That was exactly 4 days before Camille slipped into her irreversible coma. It was the exact time frame when Camille had recorded that terrified audio message about Bradley switching her pain medication. I asked Richard what Apex Wellness Concierge was. He opened a new secure search window and typed in the name. It was not a day spa. It was a highly discreet private medical clinic located in the wealthiest suburb of the city. Their public website advertised personalized vitamin infusions, elite health management, and holistic therapy for high-net-worth individuals. But Richard knew better. He told me he recognized the name from a massive corporate fraud case he had worked on years ago before losing his license. Apex Wellness was a sophisticated front. It was a notorious pill mill for the rich and powerful. Doctors at that clinic were known to write off the book prescriptions for heavy narcotics, experimental sedatives, and restricted painkillers, provided the client paid exorbitant consultation fees in cash or through unflagged corporate accounts. My blood turned to absolute ice. The realization hit me with the force of a runaway freight train. Bradley had not just switched Camille's medication with something he found in a random bathroom cabinet. He had purchased the unauthorized lethal drugs from a corrupt private doctor, and he had used my own credit card to do it. He had made me unknowingly pay for the poison that killed my only child. We finally had the financial link to the murder weapon, but Richard slammed his fist on the desk again, shattering the moment of triumph. He aggressively pointed at the screen. He told me a credit card charge only proves Bradley bought a medical consultation. It does not prove what he walked out of there with. To prove he bought the lethal medication, we needed the itemized medical receipt. Richard explained the legal nightmare ahead of us. To get a search warrant for a medical clinic, the police need probable cause. A single credit card charge for $850 is not probable cause. The clinic would simply claim Bradley came in for a standard vitamin drip and a consultation for stress management. Without a whistleblower inside the clinic or a physical copy of the prescription pad, the charge was useless in a court of law. A clinic that specializes in illegal prescriptions also specializes in destroying medical records. We were staring at the murder weapon, but it was locked inside a vault we could not legally open. The silent adjustment had just hit a massive concrete wall. I stood up from the cracked leather chair. I picked up my damp canvas coat and put it on. Richard asked me where I was going, warning me again about the police. I looked down at him. I told him I was going to Apex Wellness Concierge. I could not go near Bradley. I could not go near Vanessa, and I could not go near my grandson. But there was no restraining order keeping me away from the man who sold them the poison. I parked my rusted pickup truck between a silver sports car and a massive black luxury sport utility vehicle. Apex Wellness Concierge was located in a sleek glass building surrounded by perfectly trimmed hedges and private security cameras. It did not look like a place where sick people went to heal. It looked like a fortress where rich people went to hide their dirty secrets. I turned off the engine and sat in the cold cab for a moment, staring at the frosted glass doors. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the violent anger deep down into my stomach. I could not afford to lose my temper. If I walked in there screaming about my dead daughter, they would call the police and I would spend the rest of my life in a concrete cell. I stepped out into the freezing wind, my heavy canvas work boots sounding loud and harsh against the pristine marble walkway. I walked through the sliding doors into a lobby that smelled of expensive lavender oil and polished leather. The lighting was dim and warm, designed to keep the wealthy clients relaxed. Behind a curved mahogany reception desk sat a young man wearing designer scrubs and a gold watch that cost more than my truck. He looked up from his thin computer tablet, his eyes scanning my faded jacket and stained jeans with immediate and obvious disgust. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with polished condescension. I walked straight up to the mahogany desk and placed my credit card flat on the smooth wood. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him I was there to pick up an itemized receipt for a transaction made on my account 4 weeks ago. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of the rage burning in my chest. The young man looked at the battered plastic card, then back up at me, clearly debating whether to call building security or humor the old man standing in his immaculate lobby. He slowly picked up the credit card and began typing the name into his system. While he searched, I scanned the room. 40 years of building commercial properties had taught me how to read a structure better than most people read books. I noticed the strategic placement of the security cameras in the ceiling corners. I saw the heavy steel door behind the reception desk, the kind equipped with biometric locks usually reserved for secure medical storage. This was not a wellness center. This was a high-end drug distribution network wrapped in a pretty bow. Looking at the sterile, flawless environment, my mind drifted violently to Camille. During her final week, she had begged me to take her out of the cold, glaring lights of the hospital ward. She hated the smell of industrial antiseptic and the constant, terrifying beeping of the heart monitors. All she wanted was to be in her own bed looking out the bedroom window at the old oak tree I had planted in the front yard when she was a little girl. I had promised her I would bring her home as soon as she was physically stable. Bradley had sworn to me that he was hiring the absolute best private specialist to make that happen. Instead, he was walking into this luxury pill mill, swiping my hard-earned credit line to buy the very chemicals that were shutting her organs down. The thought of my daughter crying in pure agony while her husband casually ordered lethal sedatives from a boutique menu made my vision blur with raw hatred. But I forced the emotion back down into the dark. Anger is loud, and loud gets you arrested. I needed to be entirely invisible. I needed to be a ghost hunting a parasite. The young receptionist cleared his throat loudly, snapping my attention back to the present moment. He stared at his tablet, a confused frown creasing his smooth forehead. He confirmed the charge of $850, but noted that the patient listed on the secure medical file was Bradley Foster, not me. I did not flinch or look away. I leaned heavily against the mahogany desk, adopting the exhausted, defeated posture of an overworked father cleaning up his son-in-law's massive financial mess. I sighed deeply, rubbing the bridge of my nose with my calloused fingers. I told him Bradley was my son-in-law and that I was his primary financial guarantor for his real estate business. I explained that Bradley was currently caught in a massive federal tax audit involving his new company, Foster Holdings, and the government accountants were demanding itemized receipts for every single corporate expense over $500. I said the charge on my personal card was flagged by the bank, and if I did not provide a detailed invoice showing exactly what medical services were rendered, the Internal Revenue Service was going to freeze his entire corporate account by the end of the business day. The receptionist hesitated, his fingers hovering over the screen. He stated that strict patient confidentiality laws prevented him from handing over medical records without direct written authorization from the patient. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a hard, authoritative whisper that carried the weight of a stone. I told him this was not a request for a detailed medical history. It was a request for a basic billing invoice on a credit card that I legally owned and paid for. I warned him that if he refused to provide a receipt for a charge made on my personal account, I would have my corporate lawyer file a federal subpoena for the clinic's entire financial ledger before lunch. I knew men who worked in illegal places like this were terrified of two specific things: federal financial audits and relentless lawyers. The bluff worked perfectly. The young man swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the biometric steel door behind him. He tapped a few keys on his tablet and sent a secure document to the laser printer sitting hidden under his desk. The machine hummed quietly to life, spitting out a single sheet of crisp white paper. He slid the paper across the mahogany desk face down. I picked it up and turned it over. It was exactly what Richard told me we needed to find. The invoice detailed a private stress management consultation fee followed by the purchase of a highly restricted pharmaceutical-grade liquid sedative. It was an off-label prescription known to cause severe respiratory depression when mixed with standard pain medication. It was the exact chemical combination that had stopped my daughter's heart in the middle of the night. I folded the paper carefully and slid it deep into my jacket pocket. I nodded to the receptionist, thanked him quietly, and turned to walk toward the exit. But as my hand touched the metal handle of the sliding glass doors, the receptionist spoke again. His voice was no longer arrogant or compliant. It was panicked and sharp. He said he needed to call Bradley right now to confirm the details of the corporate tax audit just to cover his own liability. I stopped in my tracks and looked back over my shoulder. The young man was already holding his sleek cell phone to his ear, listening to it ring. I stepped out into the freezing wind and walked quickly to my truck. I had the murder weapon safely in my pocket, but the silent alarm had just been tripped. Bradley now knew someone was digging into his medical history. He knew I was hunting him. And a cornered rat with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous animal in the world. I put the truck in gear and sped out of the parking lot, knowing the real war had just begun. I slammed the heavy wooden door of Richard's office shut immediately, turning the brass deadbolt to lock it behind me. The rain had soaked through my canvas coat, dripping onto the faded carpet, but I did not care. I walked straight to his cluttered desk and dropped the crisp white paper onto the center of his legal pad. Richard looked up from his computer monitor, annoyed by the sudden intrusion, but his eyes quickly darted down to the document. I watched his face closely as he read the itemized receipt from Apex Wellness Concierge. I watched his eyes scan past the stress management consultation fee and land directly on the chemical name of the lethal liquid sedative. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the heavy rain hitting the glass window. Richard slowly reached out and touched the paper as if he expected it to burn his fingers. "We have the murder weapon," he whispered, his voice stripped of its usual sarcastic edge. He looked up at me, a dangerous smile beginning to form. But I did not smile back. I placed my calloused hands flat on his desk and leaned in. I told him the receptionist at the clinic had immediately called Bradley to verify a corporate tax audit right as I walked out the door. The smile vanished from Richard's face instantly. He cursed loudly, swiping a stack of empty coffee cups off his desk. The silent alarm was ringing. Bradley knew someone was digging into his medical history. Richard jumped up from his cracked leather chair and began pacing the narrow floor of his office. He explained the psychology of a corporate criminal perfectly. When an arrogant man who believes he is untouchable suddenly feels the heat of an investigation, he does not stay to fight. He liquidates everything he has and disappears. Bradley was currently heavily leveraged. He had poured his stolen insurance money into the commercial real estate deal, and he had illegally borrowed $1 million against my industrial land. But those assets were tied up in corporate escrow and municipal zoning approvals. He could not access that cash quickly. Richard stopped pacing and pointed directly at me. He has one massive asset he can liquidate in 24 hours. Richard said, his eyes wide with realization. The house. Your house. He is going to sell the property to the highest cash bidder, take the untraceable money, and put Vanessa and Leo on a private flight out of the country before the end of the week. My chest tightened as a wave of cold fury washed over me. I thought about that 2-story brick house. I did not just buy that property, I practically rebuilt it with my own bare hands. I remembered spending 3 consecutive summers reinforcing the foundation with steel rebar, making sure it could withstand any storm the coast could throw at it. I remembered standing on wooden scaffolding in the blistering July heat, hand pointing every single brick on the exterior to ensure no moisture would ever seep into the walls. I installed the oak floors. I built the custom mahogany cabinets in the kitchen because Camille loved to cook. I turned that structure into a fortress designed to protect my family for generations. And now a parasitic coward who had never swung a hammer in his entire life was going to sell my blood and sweat to a stranger so he could fund his escape from a murder charge. I told Richard we had to stop the sale. We had to file an injunction. Richard shook his head violently. He said an injunction would take days to process through the civil courts, and Bradley would simply use his expensive defense lawyers to stall the paperwork while he finalized the sale. We do not stop him, Richard said, slamming his hand on the desk. We let him sell it, but we make sure he sells it to us. Before I could ask him how we were going to buy $1 million house with an empty bank account, a loud chime echoed from Richard's computer speakers. He rushed back to his desk and tapped his keyboard. He had set up an automated alert on the local real estate listing service for my property address. The screen refreshed, displaying a brand new listing. There was a high-definition photograph of my house, the front lawn freshly cut, the porch light glowing warmly. Beneath the picture was the asking price. Bradley had listed the property for $600,000. The house was easily appraised at over $1.2 million. It was a massive, desperate fire sale. The listing description was brief and aggressive. It read, cash buyers only, highly motivated seller, mandatory 10-day closing, no standard inspections required. He was completely blinded by panic. He was willing to lose $500,000 in equity just to get his hands on a briefcase full of clean, untraceable cash immediately. Richard began typing furiously, opening a complex legal drafting software. He told me he was creating a blind, limited liability company, registered in a different state. He named it Obsidian Holdings. In corporate real estate, anonymous LLCs bought residential properties for cash all the time to turn them into rental portfolios. Bradley would not bat an eye at a corporate buyer. Richard explained that he had an old client, a shadowy private equity manager who owed him a massive favor from his days before he lost his license. This manager was going to provide a verifiable temporary proof of funds letter showing Obsidian Holdings had $10 million in liquid cash ready to deploy. We were going to offer Bradley his full asking price of $600,000. We were going to promise him a closing date in exactly 5 days. It was the perfect, irresistible bait for a desperate man. But the trap was not the money. The trap was buried deep in the 40-page digital contract Richard was currently typing. I watched over his shoulder as he drafted a highly irregular, lethal addendum. He called it the Absolute Disclosure of Environmental and Biological Hazards Clause. To a desperate seller skimming the document, it looked like standard corporate jargon protecting a buyer from toxic mold or asbestos, but the wording was deliberately exact. By signing the addendum, the seller legally guaranteed that no unnatural death, medical malpractice, or ongoing criminal biological investigation was associated with the premises. Furthermore, it stated that if such an event had occurred, the seller explicitly waived all rights to legal immunity, agreed to instantly forfeit the entire purchase price back to the buyer, and consented to federal jurisdiction for wire fraud because the transaction crossed state lines. Richard smiled grimly as he highlighted the text. If Bradley signed this contract, he was not just selling a house. He was legally signing a federal confession to wire fraud and providing us with the civil authority to financially ruin him the second the police proved Camille was murdered. We would take his cash, take the house back, and lock him in a federal penitentiary where he belonged. Richard attached the phantom proof of funds and sent the massive electronic contract directly to Bradley's listing agent. We sat in the dim office watching the digital clock in the corner of the computer screen slowly tick away the minutes. The silence was suffocating. I thought about Leo, my grandson, sitting in that house with a murderer and his mistress entirely unaware of the war being waged in the shadows. I prayed that Bradley's greed would override his natural suspicion. 45 minutes later, the email notification chimed loudly. Richard clicked it open. The contract had been returned. On the final page, scrawled in thick digital ink, was Bradley's signature. He had taken the bait. He had signed the absolute disclosure clause without reading it, blinded by the promise of $600,000 in clean cash. I felt a surge of dark triumph, but it was immediately cut short. Richard scrolled down to a message typed by the listing agent below the signed contract. The message stated that the seller was thrilled to proceed with the accelerated timeline. However, because Obsidian Holdings was waiving the standard independent inspection, Bradley was demanding a mandatory in-person walkthrough of the property tomorrow morning with the corporate buyer to finalize the physical handover of the keys. He wanted to look the buyer in the eye before he transferred the deed. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair, the color draining from his face. Obsidian Holdings was a fake company. We had no corporate representative to send. If Richard showed up, Bradley would instantly recognize him as a disgraced local attorney and blow the deal. If I showed up, Bradley would immediately call the police and have me thrown in jail for violating the restraining order. We had successfully locked the steel trap around his ankle, but we had to walk straight into his living room to pull the trigger. Richard stared at the computer screen, aggressively rubbing his tired eyes. We needed a corporate representative, someone who looked like he managed $10 million acquisitions before breakfast. We needed a ghost who could walk into my house, look my son-in-law in the eye, and hand him a loaded gun disguised as a real estate contract. Richard pulled a heavy burner phone from his bottom desk drawer. He told me he knew a man named Dominic. Dominic used to be an elite financial investigator for the state tax board before he realized he could make triple his government salary acting as a proxy for anonymous wealth portfolios. He was professional, utterly convincing, and most importantly, he owed Richard a massive favor that he was desperate to repay. Richard made the call. 30 minutes later, Dominic walked into the dim office wearing a tailored charcoal suit, a dark silk tie, and carrying a luxury leather briefcase that screamed corporate power. Richard quickly briefed him on the situation. He handed Dominic the printed absolute disclosure addendum and a heavy mobile notary stamp. Dominic did not ask moral questions. He did not ask about my dead daughter. He just nodded, memorized the name of our fake company, Obsidian Holdings, and asked for the exact address of the property. We had the actor, we had the trap, but we still had to execute the play perfectly. If Bradley suspected for one single second that the wealthy buyer was connected to me, he would rip up the contract, call the police, and vanish into the wind. The next morning, the sky was completely clear, but the air was biting cold. I sat in the passenger seat of Richard's unmarked sedan, parked exactly 2 blocks away from my own house. If a single city patrol car recognized me sitting within the 500-foot boundary of the restraining order, I would be arrested instantly. Dominic had parked his rented luxury vehicle right in my driveway, completely blocking the concrete path. He was currently wearing a sophisticated hidden microphone wired directly to Richard's laptop in our car. I put on a pair of heavy noise-canceling headphones. The audio fed directly into my ears, crisp and undeniably clear. I heard Dominic's confident footsteps on the porch. I heard the solid knock on my heavy mahogany front door. I heard the deadbolt slide open. Then I heard Bradley's voice. It was dripping with his usual false charm and polished arrogance. He welcomed Dominic inside immediately, bragging about the custom brickwork and the imported oak floors. I closed my eyes as a sharp physical wave of pain washed over my chest. I was forced to sit in a freezing car and listen to a murderer take credit for 40 years of my blood and sweat. Dominic played his part flawlessly. He sounded bored, incredibly wealthy, and entirely focused on closing the deal before lunchtime. He walked through the living room, his footsteps echoing through the microphone. I heard Vanessa in the background loudly packing cardboard boxes and complaining to a mover about the dust. Bradley guided Dominic into the kitchen, the exact room where I had taught Camille how to ride her first bicycle when the house was completely empty. Bradley proudly pointed out the custom mahogany cabinets I had built by hand, claiming he had personally imported the raw wood himself from South America and hired private artisans to carve it. My knuckles turned pure white as I gripped the interior door handle of Richard's car. The sheer disrespect was agonizing. I wanted to rip the car door open, march down the street, kick the front door off its hinges, and break his jaw. But I forced myself to stay completely still. Uncontrolled anger would only ruin the meticulous web we were weaving. I breathed deeply, staring at the digital audio waves on the laptop screen, and listened to the sound of Dominic opening his leather briefcase on my granite kitchen island. Dominic pulled out the heavy stack of legal documents. I heard the crisp rustle of the thick paper through the microphone. Dominic told Bradley that Obsidian Holdings was ready to wire the $600,000 into his corporate escrow account by the end of the day, completely bypassing the standard 5-day waiting period. He said his firm loved to move fast and aggressively. Bradley let out a sharp, greedy laugh. That was exactly what the parasite wanted to hear. The promise of immediate, untraceable cash blinded him entirely. But then Dominic's tone shifted. It became perfectly corporate, dry, and coldly bureaucratic. He stated that because they were bypassing the standard physical inspections, corporate policy required a strict biological and environmental disclosure form. It was a loaded bear trap hidden under thick corporate legalese. Dominic casually slid the lethal document across the granite counter. He told Bradley it was just standard liability paperwork to ensure the property had not been used as a hazardous waste site or an illegal medical facility, and that no unnatural deaths had occurred on the premises. I held my breath, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. If Bradley actually read the fine print, he would realize the document explicitly stripped away his legal immunity and served as a signed confession to wire fraud across state lines. But arrogant men never read the fine print when a massive pile of money is dangled directly in front of their faces. Bradley did not hesitate for a single second. He confidently told Dominic that the house was absolutely pristine and that nothing tragic had ever happened within those walls. I heard the distinct sharp scratch of a fountain pen against paper. Bradley signed his name. Then the mobile notary Dominic had brought along stamped the page with a loud thud, legally sealing the lie. Bradley had just committed a federal felony on a recorded corporate document. He handed over the spare set of house keys. Dominic thanked him politely, packed the signed documents back into his leather briefcase, and walked out the front door. The trap was locked. The heavy steel jaws had just snapped shut around Bradley's ankle, and he had absolutely no idea he was bleeding. 10 minutes later, Dominic opened the back door of our sedan and slid into the leather seat. He handed Richard the signed and stamped disclosure addendum. Richard looked at the signature, a massive smile of triumph breaking across his tired, lined face. We had him. We finally had the undeniable legal leverage to destroy his entire life. But Dominic did not smile. His face was pale and entirely serious. He looked directly at me in the rearview mirror. He said we had a massive, catastrophic problem. While Bradley was signing the papers in the kitchen, Dominic had overheard Vanessa confirming a telephone reservation in the hallway. They were not waiting for the escrow to officially clear through the local bank next week. Bradley had already secured a private charter flight out of the country. They were flying to Geneva tonight at exactly 9 o'clock. He was going to leave a local proxy lawyer to collect the house money, and he was taking my grandson Leo with him forever. Richard dropped the documents onto his lap, the color draining from his face. He told me the FBI wire fraud division took at least 3 weeks to process an arrest warrant based on corporate documents. We did not have 3 weeks. We had less than 10 hours before Bradley vanished across international lines completely out of federal jurisdiction. The perfect trap was suddenly useless. The legal system was simply too slow to catch a rat that was already sprinting for the border. If that plane took off, I would never see my grandson again, and my daughter's murderer would live like a king in Europe. Richard stared at the digital clock glowing on the dashboard of our unmarked sedan. The numbers read 11 in the morning. We had exactly 10 hours before Bradley Foster boarded a private jet to Geneva, taking my 8-year-old grandson across the Atlantic Ocean forever. Dominic unclipped his hidden microphone, handed the small device to Richard, and stepped out of the vehicle without saying another word. He had played his part perfectly, delivering the lethal corporate trap disguised as a real estate contract. But the parameters of the war had just shifted from a calculated, methodical financial siege to a desperate sprint for survival. I felt a cold, suffocating panic begin to rise in my throat, tight and absolute. I turned to Richard and asked him exactly how long it would take the federal authorities to execute an arrest warrant based on the signed disclosure addendum we had just acquired. Richard slammed his fist violently against the leather steering wheel. He told me the federal bureaucracy moved with the speed of a dying glacier. He explained that even with a signed confession to wire fraud on a corporate document, the federal prosecutor would need at least 3 days to review the evidence, convene an emergency grand jury, and issue an international red notice. By the time the ink was officially dry on the arrest warrant, Bradley would be sitting comfortably in a luxury chalet in Switzerland. He would be completely shielded by complex non-extradition loopholes fueled by the millions he had stolen from my family. The perfect trap we had spent the last 48 hours meticulously building was completely useless against a target that was already moving out of range. I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes. I had the physical medical receipt proving he bought the murder weapon in my pocket. I had his written confession to wire fraud on paper. But the law was simply too slow to save my bloodline. The thought of never seeing Leo again physically hurt my chest. I remembered the summer Camille brought him over to the house when he was just 4 years old. I had spent 3 entire weeks building a custom wooden treehouse in the backyard. I spent hours sanding every single wooden plank until it was perfectly smooth, so my grandson would never get a splinter. I remembered watching Camille push him on the tire swing, the sound of her genuine laughter echoing through the humid afternoon air. That treehouse was still sitting in the backyard of the brick house Bradley was currently packing up. If that private plane took off tonight, Leo would grow up in a foreign country raised by the arrogant man who had murdered his mother and the shallow mistress who had eagerly taken her place. He would be taught to forget my face. He would be manipulated into forgetting the sound of Camille's voice. I opened my eyes and looked sharply at Richard. I told him we were not waiting for the federal investigators. If Bradley was using his newly acquired corporate wealth to buy a multi-million-dollar escape, we had to burn his wallet to the ground before he ever reached the runway. I reminded Richard about the $1 million commercial loan Bradley had illegally secured using the forged deed to my industrial land. Earlier in the week, I had strictly refused to report the forgery. I wanted him to climb to the highest possible peak of arrogance before I cut the ladder from beneath him. But protecting my grandson dictated an immediate change in strategy. I told Richard to call the commercial lender right now. I told him to report the forged collateral and trigger a massive immediate bank fraud investigation. Richard hesitated for a moment, warning me that if the bank suddenly froze the commercial loan, the entire real estate deal would collapse prematurely. Bradley would instantly know someone was systematically dismantling his life, and he would realize I was the one pulling the strings. I told Richard I did not care if Bradley knew. I did not care if the trap sprung early and exposed my position. The only thing that mattered in the entire world was grounding that private charter flight. Richard grabbed his heavy laptop and opened the encrypted digital file containing the forged property deed. He did not call the local police department. He bypassed standard law enforcement entirely and went straight for the absolute apex of corporate paranoia. He searched for the bank's internal risk management division. Richard found the direct office number for the vice president of commercial lending at the exact institution that had underwritten Bradley's $1 million loan. He dialed the number and put the phone on the loudspeaker. When the executive's assistant answered the line, Richard did not ask politely. He adopted the ruthless, commanding tone of a high-priced corporate litigator preparing for a massive lawsuit. He stated firmly that he represented the true legal owner of the industrial land currently being used as collateral for Foster Holdings, and that he was sitting on undeniable proof of aggravated notary fraud. The call was instantly transferred to the vice president. Richard emailed the high-resolution digital scans of the forged signature and the fraudulent notary stamp directly to the executive's secure inbox while they spoke. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and tense. Banks do not care about domestic disputes, and they certainly do not care about stolen grandfathers, but they care deeply and aggressively about unsecured $1 million loans. The vice president stammered, his polished corporate tone vanishing as he realized that if the collateral was legally invalid, the bank was suddenly exposed to a massive, unrecoverable financial loss. Richard gave him a brutal ultimatum. He told the executive that if the bank did not instantly freeze every single account associated with Foster Holdings within the next 10 minutes, he would file a highly public civil lawsuit against the institution for gross negligence and complicity in wire fraud. The executive panicked. He frantically assured Richard that the internal fraud department was initiating a total asset freeze immediately pending a full investigation. The call disconnected with a sharp click. Richard looked over at me, a bead of cold sweat rolling down his temple. He closed the laptop. He said the accounts were officially locked. Every wire transfer, every corporate credit card, and every escrow account tied to Bradley Foster was now frozen in digital amber. We sat in the freezing car, staring down the street at my house, waiting for the financial shockwave to hit the target. It did not take long. Less than 20 minutes later, the heavy mahogany front door of my brick house swung open violently. Bradley stormed out onto the concrete porch, his face flushed bright red with absolute fury. He was gripping his expensive cell phone so hard his knuckles were stark white. He was screaming at someone on the other end of the line, completely ignoring the moving boxes stacked on the lawn. Through the hidden microphone still active in the living room, the audio fed directly into my headphones. I heard the exact context of his panic. The private aviation company had just tried to authorize the massive $70,000 charge for the international charter flight to Geneva, and the transaction had been aggressively declined by the bank. Every single corporate credit card he pulled from his expensive Italian leather wallet was instantly rejected by the system. He was financially paralyzed. I watched him kick over a ceramic potted plant on the porch, his polished, arrogant facade completely shattering into a million pieces. He was trapped. But my deep momentary satisfaction vanished entirely when I heard him march back into the house and aggressively grab Vanessa by the arm. He yelled that the bank had inexplicably frozen the corporate accounts and flagged the funds. But he was not giving up. He shouted that he still had my stolen $80,000 in pure untraceable cash sitting in a private safety deposit box at a downtown branch. He told Vanessa to grab Leo immediately. They were making a desperate run for the bank vault to secure the cash and buy commercial tickets out of the country. Richard looked at me, his eyes wide with alarm. Bradley was heading straight for the cash, and the only way to stop him from emptying that vault was for me to physically step in front of him at the bank, intentionally violating the active restraining order and risking my own immediate arrest. I stared through the windshield of Richard's unmarked sedan, watching Bradley aggressively shove Vanessa and my young grandson toward their luxury sport utility vehicle parked in my driveway. The heavy wooden door of my house slammed shut behind them, echoing down the quiet suburban street. Leo stumbled on the concrete path, struggling to keep up with Bradley's frantic, angry pace. The boy looked entirely terrified, clutching a small stuffed bear to his chest as Vanessa practically dragged him by the collar of his jacket. My heart slammed against my ribs with a violent, deafening rhythm. The restraining order in my pocket mandated that I stay 500 feet away from them at all times. If I stepped out of this car, I would be committing a crime. If I followed them to the downtown bank branch, I would be handing Bradley the exact legal justification he needed to throw me into a concrete holding cell. But as I watched Bradley forcefully buckle my weeping grandson into the backseat of his vehicle, the thin paper of the court order lost all its power over me. The law was designed to protect the innocent, but right now it was only serving as a shield for a murderer. I turned to Richard. I told him to put the car in drive and follow them. Richard gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white. He did not turn the ignition key immediately. He looked at me with a profound, heavy desperation in his eyes. He warned me that if we drove to that bank, the entire financial strategy we had meticulously built over the past 3 days would collapse into absolute chaos. He reminded me that Bradley would call the city police the second he saw my face in the lobby. I would be arrested for violating a direct court mandate, handcuffed in public, and locked inside a county jail without bail. Once I was behind bars, Bradley would easily manipulate the narrative, secure his stolen cash, and vanish on a commercial flight before the federal wire fraud warrant was ever issued. Richard begged me to stay in the car and let him handle the bank manager. I looked Richard dead in the eyes and shook my head. I told him that an attorney could not physically stop a desperate man from emptying a vault, but a grandfather with nothing left to lose absolutely could. I had spent my entire life playing by the rules, keeping my head down and trusting the system. That trust had cost me my daughter. I was not going to let it cost me my grandson. I ordered Richard to drive the car. He swallowed hard, turned the key, and slammed his foot on the gas pedal. We tore through the city streets, weaving through the heavy afternoon traffic, keeping Bradley's black vehicle in our sights. As we sped toward the financial district, my mind drifted to the $80,000 sitting in that metal box. That money was not just currency to me. It was a physical manifestation of my entire existence. It was 40 years of waking up before dawn, strapping on heavy leather tool belts, and destroying my joints on unyielding concrete foundations. I remembered the blistering summer of 2004, working on a roofing crew in 100-degree heat just to put an extra $2,000 into that specific savings account. I remembered the freezing winter of 2009, wrapping my hands in duct tape because the cold wind had cracked my skin raw just so I could hit my financial goal for the year. Every single dollar in that account was soaked in my sweat and my sacrifice. It was meant to be a permanent safety net for Camille and Leo. Now it was bundled in rubber bands, sitting in a dark vault waiting to fund the escape of the coward who had poisoned my child. The sheer injustice of it burned in my throat like swallowing crushed glass. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the crisp paper of the itemized medical receipt from the wellness clinic. I had the absolute proof of his guilt. I just needed to buy the federal authorities enough time to realize it. We pulled up to the massive marble facade of the downtown bank branch just as Bradley and Vanessa rushed through the revolving glass doors. Vanessa was practically carrying Leo, ignoring the tears streaming down the boy's face. Richard parked the sedan directly in the fire lane. He told me he was going to call the internal fraud division again to warn them about the safety deposit box, but he needed a few minutes to navigate the corporate phone tree. I told him I would buy him all the time he needed. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the towering glass doors. The cold wind bit at my face, but I did not feel it. I pushed through the revolving entrance and stepped into the cavernous, echoing lobby of the bank. The interior was lined with polished granite and thick, bulletproof glass. The air smelled of expensive floor wax and old paper. I scanned the massive room. Bradley was standing aggressively at the front desk of the secure vault area, shouting at a terrified bank teller. He was demanding immediate access to box number 704. Vanessa stood a few feet away, gripping Leo's wrist so tightly the boy's fingers were turning pale. I took a deep breath, squaring my broad shoulders, and walked directly across the pristine marble floor. Every single step I took shattered the 500-foot legal boundary of the restraining order. With every foot I closed the distance, I was walking further away from my own freedom. When I was exactly 10 feet behind him, I spoke. I did not yell. I let my deep, gravelly voice carry through the silent lobby with the weight of a falling anvil. I told Bradley to step away from the counter and let go of my grandson. Bradley spun around violently, his expensive leather shoes squeaking sharply against the polished stone. When he saw me standing there wearing my faded canvas coat and heavy work boots, his initial expression of shock instantly morphed into a twisted, triumphant smile. He could not believe his luck. The very man he was running from had just walked directly into his legal trap. He completely ignored my demand. He let go of the bank teller, pulled his cell phone from his tailored jacket, and pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. He announced to the entire lobby that I was a violent, mentally unstable stalker violating a court-ordered mandate. He demanded that the bank security guards arrest me immediately. Vanessa gasped, pulling Leo entirely behind her body, playing the role of the terrified victim flawlessly. Leo peeked around her leg, his red eyes widening when he saw me. He cried out for me, but Vanessa clamped her hand firmly over his small mouth. 2 heavily armed bank security guards immediately rushed forward from their posts by the main entrance. They unclipped the retention straps on their holsters, their hands resting cautiously on the grips of their weapons. They ordered me to raise my hands and step away from the clients. I did not resist. I did not argue. I slowly raised my calloused hands into the air, keeping my eyes locked entirely on Bradley. He was dialing the emergency police number, laughing breathlessly as he told the dispatcher that a dangerous individual was threatening his family at the downtown branch. He looked at me over the top of his phone, his eyes shining with pure, arrogant malice. He mouthed the words, "You lose, old man." He thought he had won the war. He thought he could have me hauled away in handcuffs while he casually walked into the vault, packed my $80,000 into a duffel bag, and disappeared into the sky. But as the heavy hands of the security guards clamped down on my shoulders to physically detain me, the heavy frosted glass door of the branch manager's office swung open. A tall, severe-looking woman wearing a sharp navy suit marched out onto the lobby floor. She was holding a red file folder and looking directly at Bradley. She did not look frightened by the commotion. She looked entirely furious. She ordered the security guards to hold their positions, then walked briskly to the vault reception desk. Bradley ended his call with the police flashing his polished, arrogant smile at the manager. He told her there was a slight security issue with his deranged father-in-law, but that he still urgently needed access to his private box before the police arrived to remove the trash. The branch manager did not return his smile. She placed the red folder on the marble counter with a sharp, authoritative slap. She looked Bradley up and down with absolute corporate disdain. She informed him in a loud, clear voice that nobody was accessing box number 704 today. She stated that less than 2 minutes ago, the Internal Risk Management Division had issued a catastrophic fraud alert regarding all assets tied to Foster Holdings and his personal identification number. She looked directly into Bradley's eyes and delivered the final devastating blow. She announced that the safety deposit box had just been legally sealed by the Federal Banking Authority pending a full criminal investigation into aggravated wire fraud, and that all contents inside the vault were now officially classified as frozen evidence. Bradley's triumphant smile vanished entirely, replaced by a mask of absolute suffocating panic. The color drained from his face until he looked like a walking corpse. He stammered, demanding to know who authorized the freeze, insisting it was a simple accounting error. But he knew the truth. His untraceable escape fund was completely locked away behind 3 feet of reinforced steel. He was completely broke, standing in the middle of a bank holding a plane ticket he could no longer use. I stood there with my hands still raised, feeling the cold metal of the security guard's badge pressing against my back. I had sacrificed my own legal freedom to trap him in this room, but it had worked flawlessly. However, the victory was instantly cut short. The shrill, piercing sound of approaching police sirens began to echo through the thick glass of the bank windows. The patrol cars Bradley had called were pulling up to the curb. I was about to be arrested and thrown into a cell for violating the restraining order, leaving my grandson in the hands of a desperate, cornered murderer who now had absolutely nothing left to lose. The heavy glass doors of the downtown bank branch burst open as 4 city police officers swarmed into the cavernous lobby. They did not pause to ask questions or assess the situation. They immediately saw a large black man in worn work clothes standing with his hands raised and a well-dressed white man screaming frantically for protection. I was violently shoved against the cold, polished marble counter. The rough metal of the handcuffs bit deeply into my wrists as the officers forced my arms painfully behind my back. Bradley stood just a few feet away, breathing heavily, but his eyes were no longer filled with his usual arrogant triumph. They were wide with sheer, suffocating terror. The branch manager had just permanently locked away his $80,000 escape fund, and he was staring directly at the undeniable reality of his own ruin. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice cracking as he frantically told the officers I was a violent, mentally unstable stalker violating a direct court order. He demanded they lock me away forever and throw away the key. The officers patted me down roughly, pulling my thick canvas coat tightly against my shoulders. I did not resist their grip. I did not speak a single word in my own defense. I simply turned my head and looked directly into Bradley's panicked, bloodshot eyes. I let him see the cold, absolute certainty in my gaze. He knew in that exact moment that this was not a coincidence. He realized that I was the invisible force, pulling the strings, the architect of his sudden financial destruction. He was entirely broke, and he knew I was the one who had burned his wallet to the ground. The officers marched me out of the bank, the cold wind hitting my face as they shoved me into the cramped back seat of a patrol car. The hard plastic seat offered no comfort as the heavy doors slammed shut, locking me inside a tight cage of steel and reinforced glass. As the cruiser pulled away from the curb, the siren wailing loudly, I looked out the barred window. Vanessa was rushing out of the bank, dragging my weeping grandson Leo by his small arm. Bradley followed close behind her, looking over his shoulder like a terrified, hunted animal. The sight of Leo crying out for me twisted my heart into a tight, agonizing knot. Sitting in the back of that police car, feeling the cold steel chains binding my wrists together, I thought deeply about the absolute weight of this sacrifice. When I was a young man in the late 70s working my very first construction jobs, I had watched too many good men in my neighborhood get swallowed by the criminal justice system over minor misunderstandings. I had made a silent, ironclad vow to myself that I would never give the authorities a single reason to put me in a cage. I kept my head down. I worked double shifts until my hands bled. I paid my taxes. I built a pristine, honorable life from pure concrete and sheer willpower. I had protected my freedom with everything I had. and today I had voluntarily surrendered that freedom, walking directly into a county jail cell just to buy enough time to ground a private jet. I closed my eyes as the patrol car sped through the city streets. I had given up my physical liberty, but I had successfully trapped the monster in the same city as the federal investigators. The booking process at the county jail was methodically designed to strip a man of his dignity entirely. The guards ordered me to strip off my heavy canvas coat. They took my steel-toed work boots, my leather belt, and the contents of my pockets. I watched in absolute silence as the booking officer pulled the folded, crisp white paper from my jacket pocket. It was the itemized medical receipt from the wellness clinic, the absolute physical proof that Bradley had purchased the lethal sedative. The officer casually dropped the murder weapon into a clear plastic evidence bag, completely unaware of the explosive secret it contained. I was processed and thrown into a freezing concrete holding cell that smelled strongly of industrial bleach and old sweat. I sat on the cold metal bench, listening to the heavy steel door clang shut with a deafening finality. For 3 long hours I sat in the dim light. I did not call out for a guard. I did not ask for my legally permitted phone call. I knew Richard was already moving. Finally, the heavy lock clicked open, and a tired corrections officer escorted me down a long corridor to a cramped, windowless interview room. Richard was already sitting at the metal table. His tie was loosened, his sleeves were rolled up, and he looked completely exhausted, but incredibly sharp. He slammed his heavy leather briefcase onto the table. He told me I was the most stubborn, reckless, maddening client he had ever represented in his entire career. But then a slow, grim smile spread across his weathered face. He told me my desperate, suicidal play at the bank had worked better than either of us could have anticipated. When the police arrived to arrest me, the branch manager formally documented the incident. In doing so, she entered the federal bank fraud alert directly into the local police dispatch record. I leaned forward, the heavy metal chains around my waist clinking loudly against the table. I asked Richard if the federal agents were finally ready to arrest Bradley for the wire fraud. Richard's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a deep frown. The grim, terrifying reality of our situation crashed down on us again. Richard explained that the federal warrant was still grinding slowly through the bureaucratic machinery. Bradley was completely broke, his assets were frozen, but he was not behind bars yet. And a cornered rat with nothing left to lose is capable of immense, unpredictable cruelty. Richard reached into his briefcase, pulled a thick stack of court documents, and pushed them across the metal table toward me. He told me Bradley had just retaliated with brutal, terrifying speed. Using the official police report of my arrest at the bank, Bradley had filed an emergency petition in family court just an hour ago. He claimed my public attack proved I was a lethal, unstable threat to his family, and he requested an immediate permanent out-of-state relocation order for Leo. He wanted the legal authority to take my grandson across state lines tonight, hiding out with distant relatives while he figured out how to evade the financial collapse. The family court judge, seeing a documented arrest for violating a restraining order, had scheduled an emergency custody hearing for tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. Richard looked me dead in the eyes, his voice dropping to a heavy whisper. He told me that if we do not show up to that hearing with undeniable proof of his crimes, the judge will grant Bradley full custody and the absolute right to vanish with my grandson forever. And I, Maurice, was currently locked inside a county jail cell with absolutely no way to get to that courtroom. The cinder block walls of the windowless interview room felt like they were slowly closing in on me. I stared down at the heavy metal chains binding my wrists together, the cold steel digging painfully into my skin every time I shifted my weight. Richard sat across the scratched aluminum table, his hands buried deep in his thinning hair. The digital clock mounted on the wall blinked silently, ticking closer to midnight. We had exactly 8 hours until the family court judge struck a wooden gavel and legally handed my grandson over to a murderer. I asked Richard about posting bail. I asked if there was any possible way to pay a local bondsman to walk me out of those front doors before the sun came up so I could stand in that courtroom to fight for Leo. Richard shook his head, his voice heavy with absolute defeat. He explained the grim reality of the local justice system. Because my arrest involved a direct violation of a domestic restraining order, state law strictly required a mandatory appearance before a magistrate before any bail could be set. The magistrate had already gone home for the weekend. The earliest I could possibly stand before a judge to post bond was tomorrow afternoon. By then, the emergency custody hearing would be entirely over. Bradley and Vanessa would have full legal authority over Leo. They would be sitting in a rental car crossing state lines, completely vanishing into the vast expanse of the country. They were currently broke because of the frozen bank accounts, but they did not need millions of dollars to hide in the shadows. They just needed a head start, and the county jail was giving them the exact head start they desperately needed. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the concrete wall, letting the cold reality wash over my exhausted body. I thought about the very first day I held Leo. Camille had endured a grueling 30-hour labor. When I finally walked into that sterile hospital room, she was completely exhausted and pale, but she was glowing with an undeniable, fierce kind of love. She gently placed that tiny, fragile boy into my rough, calloused hands. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes and told me that no matter what happened in this world, I had to promise to protect him. I made that promise without a single second of hesitation. I swore I would build an impenetrable wall around him. But now, sitting in a freezing concrete box, smelling the sharp stench of institutional disinfectant and old sweat, I realized how entirely powerless I truly was. I had built massive commercial structures. I had laid heavy concrete foundations that would easily last a century. But I had failed to build a defense against a man who knew exactly how to manipulate the invisible, intricate machinery of the law. Bradley did not need to be physically strong. He did not need to work hard or earn an honest living. He lived entirely by draining the life out of others, feeding on their generosity and exploiting their trust. He had intentionally used my own protective instincts to bait me into a public confrontation at the bank, knowing the local police would act as his personal security force. He had weaponized the family court. He was using the very laws designed to protect vulnerable children to legally kidnap my grandson. The sheer, overwhelming injustice of it felt like a physical weight pressing heavily down on my chest, threatening to stop my heart entirely. Richard suddenly slammed his fist hard against the metal table, the sharp noise snapping me out of my dark thoughts. He stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the concrete floor. He said he was not going to sit in a dirty room and let a wealthy parasite win on a bureaucratic technicality. He pulled his heavy burner phone from his jacket pocket. He told me that if the local legal system was rigidly designed to keep me locked inside, we had to drop a massive federal bomb on the entire building. Richard scrolled rapidly through his contacts, his thumb stopping on a name he had not called in nearly a decade. He explained that before he lost his law license, his fiercest rival in the courtroom was a ruthless, politically ambitious federal prosecutor named Gregory. Gregory was an aggressive government attorney who built his entire reputation on dismantling corrupt corporate networks and sophisticated white-collar syndicates. Gregory did not care about local restraining orders or domestic disputes. He cared about massive, headline-making federal convictions. Richard dialed the number. It was past midnight, but Gregory answered on the third ring. Richard did not exchange any polite pleasantries. He immediately offered Gregory the case of a lifetime on a silver platter. He meticulously described Foster Holdings, the million-dollar commercial bank fraud, the forged property deeds, and the illegal purchase of restricted narcotics across state lines, resulting in a homicide. He told Gregory that the entire criminal enterprise was wrapped up perfectly complete with a signed corporate confession to wire fraud. Gregory was silent for a long moment, clearly processing the sheer magnitude of the evidence. But Richard attached a brutal, non-negotiable condition. He told the federal prosecutor that the primary witness, the man who held the absolute key to the entire operation, was currently rotting in a county holding cell on a bogus local charge. Richard demanded that Gregory use his supreme federal authority to issue an emergency mandate to instantly extract me from the county jail before the sun came up. If Gregory did not get me out immediately, Richard promised to burn the evidence and let the massive fraud case completely disappear forever. Gregory demanded that Richard send him the digital files right that second. Richard opened his heavy laptop right there on the scratched interview table connected to his mobile hotspot and fired the encrypted documents straight into the federal prosecutor's secure inbox. He closed the laptop with a loud snap and looked at me. He told me all we could do now was wait and pray that the federal government moved faster than Bradley. The heavy steel door of the interview room opened, and the tired corrections officer escorted me back down the long, dim corridor to my freezing holding cell. I sat heavily on the cold metal bench, watching the dark shadows slowly crawl across the cinder block wall. Hour after hour dragged by in absolute agonizing silence. Every time I heard a footstep in the hallway, my heart pounded, hoping it was the order for my release. It was 3 in the morning when the heavy lock on my cell door finally clicked loudly. I stood up expecting to see Richard or a federal marshal standing there to take the chains off my wrists. Instead, 3 massive county guards stepped into the small cell. They were holding heavy transport shackles and thick leather restraints. The lead guard looked at me with a cold, completely dead expression. He told me I was not being released. He said the county warden had just received an urgent anonymous tip claiming I had violently threatened a police officer during my arrest at the bank, and that I was a severe, dangerous flight risk. The guard stepped forward, wrapping the thick leather belt around my waist and securing the heavy steel cuffs to my ankles. The sound of the chains rattling in the quiet cell sounded like an absolute death sentence. I was being immediately transferred to the maximum security state penitentiary located 3 hours away in the freezing mountains. The transport bus was already waiting in the loading bay. If they put me on that bus, I would be entirely unreachable by Richard or the federal prosecutor for days. I would be locked inside a violent concrete fortress while Bradley walked into a brightly lit courtroom and took my grandson away forever. Bradley had not just baited me into jail. He had used his remaining corrupt connections to pay someone on the inside to bury me completely in the dark. The heavy steel shackles around my ankles dragged against the cold concrete floor, echoing loudly through the dimly lit loading bay of the county jail. The 3 massive guards pushed me forward, their hands rough and completely devoid of any human empathy. The freezing night wind bit fiercely at my face as we stepped out into the open air. Parked under the flickering yellow security lights was the state transport bus. It was a massive armor-plated vehicle designed to swallow men whole and transport them into absolute darkness. The engine idled with a deep vibrating rumble that shook the ground beneath my heavy work boots. I knew exactly where that rusted steel monster was heading. It was scheduled to drive 3 hours straight up into the freezing, isolated mountains, delivering inmates to a maximum security penitentiary where phone calls were non-existent and legal representation was blocked by miles of bureaucratic red tape. If they put me on that bus, I would disappear entirely. I would be a ghost trapped behind razor wire while Bradley stood in a brightly lit family courtroom tomorrow morning wearing an expensive tailored suit and playing the perfectly rehearsed role of the terrified protective father. The lead guard shoved me roughly toward the open metal door of the bus. I stumbled forward, the heavy leather restraint around my waist, biting sharply into my ribs and restricting my ability to catch my balance. I climbed the steep metal steps, the chains restricting my movement so severely that I nearly fell backward onto the hard concrete. The interior of the bus was a terrifying cage of thick wire mesh and bolted steel seats. The air inside smelled of stale sweat, diesel exhaust, and raw fear. I sat down heavily on a freezing metal bench in the far back corner. The guard locked the reinforced door from the outside, trapping me in the dark. I looked out through the tiny, scratched plexiglass window at the yellow security lights fading into the black night. I felt an overwhelming, suffocating sense of failure crushing my chest. I had spent 40 years building a life out of pure sweat and solid concrete. I had always believed that hard work, unyielding endurance, and brutal honesty were an impenetrable shield against the evils of the world. But sitting in that freezing cage, staring at the thick steel mesh, I realized how incredibly naive I had been. Hard work does not protect you from a man who buys his way through the shadows. Bradley had effortlessly used a handful of bribes and a fabricated anonymous tip to completely erase me from the board. He did not need to swing a hammer or break a sweat. He just needed to whisper a polished lie into the right ear, and the entire county justice system moved rapidly to execute his will. I closed my eyes and pictured Leo. I imagined my small grandson waking up in a strange hotel room, frightened and confused, surrounded by the very people who had murdered his mother. He would be dragged into a sterile courtroom, completely unaware that his grandfather was currently locked inside a moving steel box, heading toward the mountains. The sheer agony of failing my daughter twice was a physical pain sharper than any knife I had ever felt. I gripped the chains binding my wrists together, pulling against the heavy steel until my calloused skin began to tear and bleed. I wanted to break the metal. I wanted to tear the wire mesh apart with my bare hands, but the cold steel remained entirely unyielding. The driver climbed into the front cab, separating himself from the prisoners behind a thick wall of bulletproof glass. He shifted the heavy vehicle into gear. The bus lurched forward, the air brakes hissing loudly in the quiet night. We rolled slowly toward the massive chain-link security gate at the edge of the loading bay. The gate began to slide open, screeching against its rusted metal tracks. I braced myself for the long, dark ride into oblivion. But suddenly the dark loading bay was flooded with blinding, searing white light. The driver slammed his heavy boot on the brakes, throwing me violently forward against the wire mesh. 3 massive black sport utility vehicles had just swerved aggressively into the driveway, completely blocking the exit. Their tires screamed loudly against the cold pavement. The doors of the vehicles flew open simultaneously, and a dozen men wearing dark tactical jackets poured out into the freezing wind. They did not wear the standard blue uniforms of the local city police. They wore heavy Kevlar vests emblazoned with bright yellow letters indicating absolute federal authority. The lead federal agent marched directly up to the front cab of the transport bus. He was a tall, sharply dressed man with a face carved from solid granite. He carried a heavy leather briefcase in one hand and a gold federal badge in the other. He did not ask the bus driver to open the door. He ordered it with a voice that commanded absolute, unquestioning obedience. The terrified driver hit the hydraulic release, and the heavy metal doors hissed open. The local county guards rushed out of the holding area, their hands resting defensively on their duty belts, shouting that this was a secure county transport and demanding to know what was happening. The tall federal agent did not even blink. He walked right past the angry guards and slapped a thick stack of federal court documents directly onto the chest of the county warden, who had just rushed out of his office in a panic. The agent announced his name loudly. He was Gregory, the ruthless federal prosecutor Richard had called just an hour ago. Gregory informed the warden that the anonymous tip generating my transfer was officially classified as an act of federal obstruction of justice, tied directly to an ongoing massive wire fraud and homicide investigation. He stated that the prisoner sitting in the back of the transport bus was no longer under local county jurisdiction. He was officially a protected material witness for the United States government. Gregory looked the warden dead in the eyes and told him that if the shackles were not removed from my wrists in exactly 30 seconds, he would have every single county officer in the loading bay immediately arrested for actively conspiring with a murderer. The county warden turned completely pale. He did not argue. He did not ask to verify the documents. He immediately signaled his guards, who rushed onto the bus with trembling hands and quickly unlocked the heavy steel chains binding my ankles and wrists. I rubbed my bruised skin, feeling the blood finally rushing back into my numb hands. I stepped off the freezing transport bus and walked over to Gregory. Richard stepped out from behind one of the black vehicles, looking completely exhausted but intensely focused. He handed me back my heavy canvas coat. I thanked Gregory for stopping the bus and pulling me out of the dark. But Gregory did not smile. His face remained entirely severe and cold. He told me not to thank him yet. He explained that while he had the supreme authority to pull me out of a county jail on an obstruction charge, the actual federal arrest warrant for Bradley was still stuck in a massive bureaucratic backlog. A federal judge needed to formally review the medical receipt and the forged corporate contracts before signing the arrest order, and that judge was not waking up for another 3 hours. Gregory looked down at his expensive wristwatch. It was currently 6 in the morning. He told me the emergency custody hearing for my grandson was scheduled for 8 o'clock sharp in the state family court. Gregory looked me dead in the eyes and delivered the final crushing reality. Federal agents have absolutely no legal jurisdiction in a state family court. Gregory and his armed men could not simply walk into the courtroom and drag Bradley away. If Bradley convinced the local family judge to grant him permanent custody and the right to relocate before the federal warrant was signed, he could walk right out the back doors of the courthouse and vanish across state lines before Gregory's men could legally touch him. I was free from the physical chains, but the war was far from over. I had exactly 2 hours to walk into a hostile courtroom, face the arrogant man who murdered my daughter, and completely destroy his polished lies using nothing but my bare hands and the raw truth. The morning sun was a cold, pale disk in the gray sky as Richard pulled the unmarked sedan into the crowded parking lot of the state family courthouse. It was exactly 15 minutes before 8 o'clock. I had not slept in 2 days. My wrists were deeply bruised and swollen from the heavy steel transport chains, and my faded canvas work coat was stained with the grime of the county jail cell. I looked like a man who had lost everything. But as I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the courthouse, I felt a strange, cold clarity settle deep inside my chest. I walked through the metal detectors and stepped into the bustling marble hallway. Standing outside courtroom 4 was Bradley. He was wearing an immaculate navy blue tailored suit, his hair perfectly styled, flanked by two expensive family law attorneys carrying thick leather briefcases. Vanessa stood safely behind them, holding my terrified grandson by the hand. When Bradley saw me walking down the corridor, his arrogant smile completely vanished. He physically took a step backward, his eyes darting frantically around the hallway as if he expected the county guards to tackle me. He had paid good money to have me buried on a mountain transport bus. Seeing me standing free in the courthouse completely shattered his polished composure. I did not break eye contact. I walked right past him and pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. The courtroom was paneled in dark oak and smelled of lemon polish and old paper. The judge sitting behind the elevated bench was an older, stern woman who looked down at her docket with absolute authority. She did not like disruptions, and she clearly did not like the way I looked. When Bradley and his high-priced legal team entered the room, they instantly commanded respect. They looked like they belonged in a place of power. I sat at the bare defendant table next to Richard, feeling the heavy weight of the institutional bias pressing down on my shoulders. I had seen this exact dynamic play out decades ago. When I was a young contractor in my 30s, I took a wealthy real estate developer to civil court because he refused to pay my crew for 6 months of brutal labor. I brought my honest ledgers and my calloused hands. He brought a team of slick lawyers and a perfectly pressed suit. The judge in that case did not look at my evidence. He looked at my worn boots, listened to the developer's smooth lies, and dismissed my claim entirely. The legal system has a long, ugly history of favoring the polished parasite over the rough laborer. Bradley was relying entirely on that exact prejudice today. He expected the judge to look at my dirty canvas coat, read the police report about my arrest at the bank, and immediately hand my grandson over to the wealthy, civilized father. He wanted to use my race, my age, and my class as the final nails in my coffin. I looked across the aisle at Leo. My grandson was trembling, his small hands gripping the edge of the wooden bench. I swore to myself right then that I would tear this entire courtroom down before I let history repeat itself. The judge struck her wooden gavel and called the emergency custody hearing to order. Bradley's lead attorney stood up immediately. He was a master of theatrical outrage. He painted a horrifying, completely fabricated picture for the judge. He claimed that I was a violently unhinged grandfather suffering from severe psychological trauma after the death of my daughter. He presented the active restraining order as absolute proof of my instability. He then dramatically produced the police report from the downtown bank branch, loudly describing how I had stalked his client, violated a direct court mandate, and violently threatened his family in a public space. The attorney concluded his opening statement by demanding that the court grant Bradley permanent sole legal custody and the immediate right to relocate out of state to protect the child from my dangerous obsession. The judge listened intently, her expression hardening into a severe frown. She looked down at me over her reading glasses, her eyes filled with cold judgment. She asked Richard if he had any possible defense for his client's repeated documented violations of court orders. She warned him that my behavior was entirely unacceptable and that she was fully prepared to sign the relocation order immediately. Richard slowly stood up from his chair. He did not yell. He did not attempt to argue about the bank incident or the restraining order. He understood that fighting Bradley on the grounds of character was a losing battle in a biased room. Instead, Richard attacked the one thing the family court required for an out-of-state relocation: financial stability. Richard walked confidently up to the judge's bench and handed her a thick stack of certified financial documents. He announced clearly to the entire courtroom that Bradley Foster was not a successful corporate executive seeking a fresh start for his traumatized son. He was a completely broke, desperate fugitive attempting to flee the state before the federal government indicted him. Bradley shot out of his chair, his face turning bright red, screaming that Richard was lying and demanding the judge strike the statement from the record. The judge slammed her gavel down heavily, ordering Bradley to sit down and remain entirely silent. Richard directed the judge to the second page of the documents. It was the official affidavit from the downtown bank manager formally verifying the catastrophic internal fraud alert. Richard explained that every single bank account, credit line, and corporate escrow associated with Foster Holdings had been legally frozen due to suspected aggravated wire fraud. Richard then produced the signed corporate addendum from the fake real estate deal. He showed the judge how Bradley had illegally leveraged forged property deeds to secure commercial loans. Richard looked directly at Bradley's expensive lawyers, who were now frantically whispering to each other, completely blindsided by the financial ambush. Richard stated that the father requesting the relocation order did not possess a single dollar to his name. He could not provide housing, he could not pay for the child's basic needs, and he was currently under active investigation by the Federal Risk Management Authority. Bradley was trapped. He could not refute the banking documents without admitting his massive corporate fraud on the official court record. He sat entirely paralyzed, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. He had walked into the room expecting a quick, easy victory over an old man. Instead, his entire financial facade was bleeding out on the courtroom floor. The judge stared at the bank affidavits for a long, heavy moment. The silence in the room was absolute. She took off her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. I felt a surge of massive hope. We had successfully proven he was broke and desperate, but my hope was instantly shattered. The judge looked at Richard and shook her head. She stated that while the allegations of corporate bank fraud were certainly alarming, they were not the primary jurisdiction of a state family court. She explained that financial difficulties, even severe ones involving federal investigations, did not automatically terminate a biological father's right to custody. She pivoted her attention right back to the police report sitting on her desk. She told Richard that her absolute priority was the physical safety of the child. And right now, the only documented physical threat in the room was the grandfather with an active restraining order and a fresh arrest record for public harassment. She raised her pen, hovering it over the final relocation order. She announced that she was granting Bradley temporary custody and permission to leave the state pending the outcome of his financial investigations. Bradley let out a sharp, breathless laugh of sheer triumph. He had survived the ambush. The judge was going to let him walk out the door with my grandson. I knew the federal warrant was still hours away. If I let her sign that paper, the war was over. I stood up from my chair, ignoring Richard's frantic whisper to sit down. I reached deep into the pocket of my faded canvas coat and pulled out the crisp white medical receipt. It was time to show the court the murder weapon. I stood up from my chair, completely ignoring the frantic warning whisper from Richard. The wooden legs of my seat scraped loudly against the polished floor, drawing the attention of every single person in the room. I reached deep into the pocket of my faded canvas coat and pulled out the crumpled white paper. I walked straight toward the elevated wooden bench. The armed court bailiff instantly stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on his utility belt, ordering me to step back behind the defendant table. But I did not stop. I looked directly into the eyes of the stern family court judge. I held the itemized medical receipt high in the air so the bright fluorescent lights illuminated the black ink. I told her that the man sitting across the aisle did not just steal my life savings and forge my signature on commercial real estate documents. I told her he had murdered my only daughter. The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Bradley shot out of his chair, his face entirely devoid of color, screaming that I was a deranged lunatic and demanding that the bailiff arrest me immediately. His expensive lawyers were shouting over him, throwing their hands in the air, and objecting to my unsworn testimony. But I kept my eyes locked entirely on the judge. I reached over the low wooden gate and placed the receipt from Apex Wellness Concierge flat on her bench. I told her to look at the date of the transaction and read the name of the restricted liquid sedative printed clearly on the invoice. I told her that my credit card had paid for the exact poison that stopped Camille from breathing. The judge slammed her wooden gavel down repeatedly, the sharp cracks echoing like gunshots until the room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. She looked down at the piece of paper. Bradley completely froze in his tracks. The polished, confident mask he had worn all morning melted away entirely. He was no longer a wealthy corporate executive. He was a terrified coward, realizing his darkest secret had just been placed directly under a microscope. The judge picked up the receipt with hesitant fingers. I watched her read the name of the lethal chemical. I told her that exactly 4 days after Bradley purchased that unauthorized sedative, my vibrant, beautiful daughter went into an irreversible coma. Standing in that silent courtroom, the memory of her final days hit me with the physical force of a swinging hammer. I remembered the exact moment the hospital monitors started sounding their frantic, high-pitched alarms. I was sitting in a cheap plastic chair beside her bed, holding her fragile hand. Camille had spent her entire life bringing warmth to everyone she touched. She was a brilliant elementary school teacher who bought winter coats for her students using her own meager salary. She was a loving mother who spent hours building blanket forts in the living room for Leo. When the doctors rushed into her room that terrible night and pushed me out into the cold hallway, I watched through the small glass window as they tried desperately to restart her heart. The head doctor later told me her body had simply given out due to the massive strain of her illness. but I knew in my gut that something was entirely wrong. My daughter was a fierce fighter. She had promised Leo she would take him to see the ocean when she got better. She would never simply close her eyes and give up. And I remembered Bradley standing next to me in that hospital hallway, burying his face in his hands and sobbing loudly for the benefit of the nursing staff. He had comforted me while the poison he bought was still circulating in her veins. Now sitting in the cold hands of a family court judge was the absolute proof of his pure evil. I looked at the judge and told her that if she signed that relocation document, she would be handing an innocent 8-year-old boy directly to a calculated killer. Bradley began to hyperventilate. He grabbed his lead attorney by the arm, whispering frantically, his forehead glistening with cold sweat. Vanessa let go of Leo's hand and physically backed away from the table, suddenly realizing the sheer magnitude of the crime she had attached herself to. The lead attorney violently pushed Bradley away and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He was a professional hired to win family disputes and negotiate alimony, not to defend a murder suspect in open court. But he recovered his polished composure quickly. He addressed the judge with a smooth, incredibly condescending tone. He stated that a single piece of paper printed from an unverified private clinic proved absolutely nothing. He argued that the document could have been easily fabricated by a bitter, vindictive old man, desperate to maintain control over his grandson. Furthermore, he aggressively reminded the judge of the strict, unyielding boundaries of her legal jurisdiction. He stated clearly that family court was not a venue for conducting homicide investigations or evaluating forensic evidence. If I had genuine criminal evidence, I should have presented it to the local police department, not ambushed a civil custody hearing with wild, unsubstantiated conspiracy theories. The judge slowly lowered the receipt onto her desk. She looked at me with a mixture of deep personal pity and institutional rigidity. She told me her courtroom was strictly governed by the state family code. She explained that without an active police investigation, a signed medical examiner report, or a formal criminal indictment from a grand jury, she simply could not accept a piece of paper as factual evidence of a homicide. The burden of proof for a murder allegation belonged entirely to the criminal courts. Her sole legal responsibility today was determining the immediate physical placement and safety of the child. She pointed a manicured finger at the police report sitting on top of her files. She reminded me that I was still a documented flight risk with an active restraining order and a fresh arrest record for public violence at a downtown bank. I felt a cold, crushing weight settle in my stomach. Richard stood up and argued fiercely, citing obscure jurisdictional overlaps and begging her to delay the ruling for just 24 hours. But the judge shook her head firmly. Bradley let out a massive, trembling sigh of relief. He sat up straight in his chair, a sickening, triumphant smirk returning to his pale face. He knew the rigid bureaucracy of the legal system was going to save his life. The judge picked up her heavy black pen. She announced that while she found my allegations deeply disturbing, she was legally bound to follow the established code. She moved the tip of her pen toward the final signature line on the relocation order. I watched the dark ink approach the crisp white paper, feeling my entire world collapsing into a bottomless pit. I had sacrificed my freedom, played my final card, and the blind rigidity of the law was completely rejecting it. If she signed her name, Leo was gone forever. The judge pressed the pen against the document. But before she could form the first letter of her signature, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open with a deafening crash. Everyone in the room turned around in absolute shock. Standing in the doorway was Gregory, the federal prosecutor, flanked by 6 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical gear. Gregory did not ask for permission to enter the state courtroom. He marched straight down the center aisle, holding a thick stack of documents stamped with the bright red seal of a federal judge. His voice boomed across the silent room like thunder. He looked directly at the family court judge and announced that the state proceedings were officially suspended under federal authority. He stated that he possessed a freshly signed federal arrest warrant for Bradley Foster for the crimes of aggravated wire fraud and interstate medical homicide. Bradley did not wait for the agents to cross the room. In a state of absolute cornered panic, he violently grabbed Leo by the collar of his jacket, pulled a concealed metal pocket knife from his tailored suit, and dragged my screaming grandson backward toward the judge's private chamber's door. I pulled my heavy work boots back as far as the narrow, dark tunnel would allow. I took one deep, ragged breath of the dusty air and thrust my legs forward with every single ounce of strength I had left in my exhausted body. The thick rubber soles of my boots slammed violently into the aluminum ventilation grate. The ancient metal screamed, the heavy screws tearing instantly from the old drywall. The heavy grate gave way, plummeting 10 feet to the floor below and crashing violently onto the judge's mahogany desk. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I swung my legs over the jagged edge of the opening and dropped straight down into the burning room. I hit the polished hardwood floor hard, rolling my heavy shoulders to absorb the massive impact. But my ruined knees flared with white-hot, agonizing pain. The room was already a suffocating, blinding nightmare. The toxic black smoke pouring from the burning offshore banking ledgers was thick and heavy, clinging to the high ceiling and creeping rapidly down the walls. The heat was incredibly intense, completely overpowering the building's ancient air conditioning system. The shrill, deafening scream of the automated fire alarms pierced my eardrums, but I forced myself to stand up. Bradley spun around, coughing violently into his tailored sleeve, his eyes wide with absolute paralyzed disbelief. He had expected federal agents in heavy tactical gear to break down the reinforced oak door. He never in his life expected a 69-year-old grandfather to fall directly from the ceiling like a vengeful ghost. He was still gripping the sharp silver pocket knife, his knuckles stark white, but his hands were trembling uncontrollably. He looked at my face covered in thick white plaster dust and dried blood from crawling through the maintenance space. I slowly stood to my full height, completely ignoring the burning pain shooting up my legs. I looked past him to the dark corner of the room. Leo was curled into a tight, terrified ball on the leather sofa, burying his small face deep into his knees. He was coughing weakly, his small chest heaving as the dark, poisonous smoke filled his fragile lungs. Seeing my grandson actively suffocating in that toxic cloud ignited a primal, uncontrollable fire deep inside my chest. For 40 long years, I had used my calloused hands to build homes, to lay heavy bricks, and to pour unyielding concrete foundations. I had never used my hands to destroy another human being. I had always believed that violence was the absolute last resort of a failed man. But as I stared through the thick smoke at the arrogant coward who had poisoned my beautiful daughter and was now suffocating my only grandson, I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to break him. Bradley took a step backward, pointing the trembling blade at my chest. He began screaming hysterically, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. He yelled that I had ruined his entire life, that I had destroyed his corporate empire, and that he was never going to spend the rest of his life rotting inside a federal prison cell. He was trying to convince himself that he still had the upper hand, that holding a small piece of sharpened steel made him a dangerous man. But he was not a dangerous man. He was a parasite who only knew how to attack people when they were sleeping or legally bound. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. I told Bradley to drop the knife and move away from the boy. My voice was low, raspy from inhaling the burning smoke, but it carried the absolute heavy certainty of a death sentence. Bradley panicked. The last shred of his polished corporate sanity snapped completely. He lunged at me, swinging the sharp silver blade wildly toward my chest, screaming in pure desperation. He was young and fast-fueled entirely by the raw adrenaline of a cornered animal. But he was a man who spent his entire life typing on keyboards and holding crystal cocktail glasses. I had spent my entire life swinging heavy steel hammers and carrying massive wooden beams. As the deadly blade came toward me, I did not step back. I stepped directly inside his reach. I raised my left forearm intentionally, letting the sharp blade slice deeply through my heavy canvas coat and bite right into the flesh of my arm. The sudden pain was sharp and blinding, but I ignored it completely. With my massive right hand, I grabbed his wrist with the crushing, unyielding grip of a heavy industrial vice. I twisted his arm violently backward until I heard the sickening loud pop of his shoulder completely dislocating from its socket. Bradley let out an agonizing, high-pitched scream. The silver pocket knife slipped immediately from his numb fingers, clattering harmlessly to the wooden floor. I did not stop to watch him suffer. I drove my heavy steel-toed work boot directly into the side of his knee, buckling his leg entirely. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor like a broken doll, clutching his ruined shoulder, gasping pathetically for air in the thick black smoke. I kicked the sharp knife far under the heavy mahogany desk. I rushed over to the leather sofa and scooped Leo into my arms. His small body was terrifyingly limp, his breathing incredibly shallow and ragged. I wrapped my bleeding left arm around his fragile shoulders, pulling his face tightly against my chest to shield him from the toxic air. I turned toward the reinforced oak door. Bradley had shoved the massive mahogany desk securely against it, creating a barricade. I planted my boots firmly on the floor, pressed my broad back against the heavy wooden desk, and pushed with every single ounce of leverage I possessed. The heavy wood scraped loudly across the floor, clearing the doorway. I reached out and violently twisted the deadbolt. The heavy oak door swung open instantly. The 6 federal agents waiting outside in the hallway rushed into the smoke-filled room, their black rifles raised and ready. 2 agents forcefully grabbed Bradley from the floor. He shrieked in pain because of his dislocated shoulder, but the agents offered absolutely no mercy. They slammed him roughly against the wall, kicking his legs apart, and secured heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. The federal prosecutor, Gregory, marched into the room through the thick smoke. He looked down at Bradley, who was now sobbing pathetically on the floor. Gregory read him his federal rights with a voice completely devoid of emotion, officially charging him with aggravated wire fraud, federal obstruction, and interstate medical homicide. It was the absolute end of Bradley Foster. His stolen empire was gone, his freedom was permanently revoked, and he was going to spend the rest of his natural life locked inside a concrete federal penitentiary. Gregory grabbed my shoulder and pulled me out of the toxic room into the bright, chaotic marble hallway. The clean, cool air hit my face, but I did not feel any sense of victory or relief. I collapsed onto my knees on the hard floor, holding Leo tightly in my massive arms. The courtroom was in total disarray. Vanessa was already in handcuffs, screaming at the local police that she knew absolutely nothing about the murder, completely turning on Bradley to save her own skin. But I did not care about her. I only cared about the small, fragile boy in my arms. The victory was instantly swallowed by a new, absolutely terrifying reality. Leo was not waking up. His eyes were rolled back in his head, and his small lips were turning a dangerous, sickly shade of blue. The thick black smoke from the burning offshore ledgers was not just burning paper. The heavy binders were made of synthetic plastics, and the toxic chemical fumes had severely poisoned his small developing lungs. He was entirely unresponsive. Gregory screamed furiously into his radio, demanding emergency medical personnel to the 4th floor immediately. I pressed my calloused fingers against Leo's neck, searching desperately for a pulse. It was there, but it was incredibly faint and erratic. I knelt on the cold marble floor of the courthouse, holding my unconscious grandson bleeding heavily from the knife wound on my arm. The parasite was finally in chains, but as I looked down at Leo's pale face, I realized with pure suffocating horror that Bradley's final act of desperation might have just claimed the absolute last living piece of my family. The heavy thud of combat boots and emergency medical equipment echoed loudly down the marble hallway of the state courthouse. 2 paramedics burst through the broken double wooden doors, carrying heavy orange trauma bags and a portable oxygen tank. I was still kneeling on the hardwood floor, my massive arms wrapped tightly around my unconscious grandson. The paramedics dropped to their knees beside us. They did not waste a single second with polite introductions or questions. One of them forcefully pulled Leo from my chest, immediately placing a clear plastic oxygen mask over his small, pale face. The other paramedic began aggressively pumping the manual resuscitator bag, forcing clean air directly into his smoke-filled lungs. I stood up slowly, my ruined knees screaming in absolute protest, warm blood dripping steadily from the deep knife wound on my left arm. I watched them lift my grandson onto a wheeled stretcher and sprint down the wide corridor. I followed them blindly. The heavily armed federal agents parted silently to let us pass. The chaotic noise of the courthouse faded into a dull, distant hum in my ears. I did not care about Bradley screaming pathetic profanities as the agents dragged him toward the freight elevator. I did not care about the local police securing the burning chambers. I climbed into the back of the flashing ambulance, sitting heavily on the cold metal bench, completely ignoring the paramedic who tried to wrap a tight gauze bandage around my bleeding arm. My eyes were locked entirely on the small chest of my grandson, praying desperately for a single natural breath. The siren wailed loudly above us, cutting through the freezing city traffic, but the sound was entirely meaningless to me. The emergency room at the city hospital was a blindingly bright, sterile nightmare. The sharp chemical smell of industrial bleach and medical antiseptic immediately triggered a massive, suffocating wave of panic deep inside my chest. It was the exact same sickening smell from the night I lost my daughter. The medical staff wheeled Leo through a set of heavy swinging doors into the intensive trauma bay, physically blocking me from following them inside. I was left standing entirely alone in the crowded waiting area, my faded canvas coat covered in white drywall dust, dark toxic soot and dried blood. A young emergency room nurse approached me cautiously, holding a thick gauze pad and a bottle of sterile saline. She gently insisted on cleaning the deep laceration on my forearm. I sat down heavily on a cheap plastic chair and let her work without saying a word. The sharp sting of the alcohol washing out the open wound grounded me, pulling my racing mind back to the brutal reality of the present moment. I stared at the blank white wall opposite my chair. I had spent my entire life trying to be the impenetrable bedrock of my family. When I was pouring heavy concrete in the freezing rain decades ago, I always told myself that every ounce of physical pain was a necessary sacrifice to ensure Camille would never have to suffer. But the world is inherently cruel, and it actively preys on the innocent and the generous. I had focused so entirely on building a strong financial fortress that I completely failed to recognize the smiling parasite standing right inside the front door. Bradley had used my own protective nature as a lethal weapon against me. He knew I would gladly surrender my money, my home, and my legal freedom to keep my daughter and grandson safe, and he exploited that unconditional love until there was absolutely nothing left to take. I looked down at my rough, heavily scarred hands. They were shaking uncontrollably under the bright fluorescent lights. If the toxic smoke permanently damaged Leo's lungs, the victory in the courtroom would be completely meaningless. I would have successfully locked a murderer in a federal cage, but I would spend the rest of my days visiting 2 graves instead of 1. 3 agonizing hours passed in absolute crushing silence. The automatic sliding doors of the emergency room finally hissed open, and Richard walked in, followed closely by the federal prosecutor, Gregory. Richard looked completely exhausted, his necktie entirely removed and his expensive dress shirt covered in dark soot from the courtroom hallway. He walked over to my plastic chair and sat down heavily beside me. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of fresh legal documents. He told me the immediate legal war was officially over. Bradley Foster was currently sitting in a maximum security federal holding cell without any possibility of bail. The federal judge had meticulously reviewed the forged corporate deeds, the banking fraud alerts, and the medical receipt I had provided. Because Bradley had actively taken a child hostage at knife point and attempted to destroy federal evidence with fire, he was automatically classified as a supreme flight risk and a violent, lethal threat to the public. He was never going to see the outside of a prison wall again. Gregory added that Vanessa had completely folded the second the heavy steel handcuffs clicked around her wrists. She had formally agreed to turn state evidence, providing the federal agents with the exact location of Bradley's hidden offshore accounts in exchange for a reduced sentence for accessory to wire fraud. The massive commercial real estate deal was entirely canceled. The frozen bank accounts were actively being seized by the government to restitute the stolen funds back to my name. The 2-story brick house I had built with my own bare hands was legally secure. The parasite was completely eradicated. But none of those words brought me any comfort. I looked past Richard, my eyes fixed entirely on the heavy, swinging doors of the trauma bay. Finally, a tall doctor wearing green surgical scrubs walked through the doors. He looked completely exhausted, pulling a blue surgical mask down around his neck. He walked directly toward me. He stated that the toxic plastic smoke had caused severe chemical pneumonitis, severely inflaming the boy's delicate respiratory tract. My heart stopped entirely in my chest. But then the doctor offered a small, tired smile. He said that because I had broken into the room and shielded the boy's face with my heavy canvas coat, I had successfully prevented massive, irreversible lung damage. Leo was officially stabilized, breathing entirely on his own, and expected to make a full physical recovery within a few short weeks. A massive, crushing weight lifted instantly from my shoulders. I buried my face in my calloused hands, letting out a long, heavy breath of pure relief. I stood up immediately, demanding to see my grandson. The doctor nodded and turned to lead me down the sterile white hallway. But before I could take a single step toward the trauma bay, a tall woman wearing a sharp gray business suit and carrying a thick clipboard stepped directly into my path. She held up a small plastic identification badge blocking my way. She announced that she was a senior caseworker for the State Department of Child Protective Services. Her voice was completely devoid of any human empathy or understanding. She stated that since the biological mother was deceased and the biological father was currently in federal custody for homicide, the state was legally assuming immediate emergency guardianship of the minor child. I told her I was his grandfather and I was taking him home today. She looked at me with cold, bureaucratic disdain. She pointed her silver pen directly at my chest. She told me that according to the active police database, I had a documented arrest record from yesterday afternoon for public violence, and an active restraining order prohibiting me from being within 500 feet of the child. She announced that I was legally and financially unfit to claim custody, and she was placing Leo into the state foster care system tonight. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor illuminated the silver badge pinned to the lapel of the Child Protective Services worker. She stood between me and the trauma bay doors like a completely unyielding brick wall. I had just walked through fire bled on the floor of a burning courthouse and watched my grandson take his first unassisted breath in hours. Now this cold, bureaucratic agent was telling me she was taking him away. She tapped her silver pen against her thick clipboard, repeating her absolute mandate. My arrest record for public violence at the bank and the active restraining order legally disqualified me from assuming guardianship. The state was seizing Leo. He was going into the foster care system tonight. I looked down at my heavily bandaged arm, the dull ache entirely overshadowed by the massive spike of panic shooting through my chest. The law had been manipulated by a murderer to keep me away from my family, and even with that murderer sitting in a federal holding cell, the poisonous legal trap he set was still actively working. The state did not care that I had orchestrated that bank arrest to ground a flight. They did not care that Bradley was a monster who had held a knife to the boy's throat. They only cared about the black ink on the police report and the rigid policies printed in their manuals. The Child Protective Services worker turned her back on me and signaled for 2 hospital security guards to escort her into the trauma bay to process the child. I felt the familiar dangerous heat of raw fury rising in my throat. I wanted to grab her clipboard, throw it across the sterile hallway, and physically barricade the doors. But I forced my heavy work boots to remain firmly planted on the linoleum floor. Violence against a state agent would guarantee I never saw Leo again. I had to fight the system using its own rigid rules. I stared at the closed doors, a profound dread washing over me. I knew exactly what the state foster care system did to young, traumatized boys. Decades ago, my younger brother was temporarily placed into state custody after our mother fell severely ill and our father vanished. I was only 19 years old, working 3 exhausting jobs, desperately trying to earn enough money to prove to the state I could provide for him. By the time I finally navigated the endless legal bureaucracy and brought him home 2 years later, the system had entirely broken his spirit. He went from a bright, laughing child to a hollow, silent shell, deeply scarred by the cold indifference of group homes and rotating strangers. I spent the rest of his short life trying to repair the psychological damage the state had inflicted. I swore on his grave I would never let another piece of my bloodline fall into that grinding institutional machine. Leo had just lost his mother to a murderer and nearly died in a toxic fire started by his own father. If they put him into a sterile foster home with absolute strangers tonight, the psychological trauma would completely destroy him. He needed his own bed. He needed the old oak tree in the front yard. He needed me. I turned sharply to Richard and Gregory. Richard was already moving. He stepped directly in front of the Child Protective Services worker, physically blocking her path to the trauma bay doors. He adjusted his soot-stained suit and adopted his most aggressive, intimidating legal posture. He told her she was making a catastrophic career mistake. He explained that the restraining order and the bank arrest were fraudulent mechanisms engineered by a federal fugitive to facilitate an interstate kidnapping. Gregory, the ruthless federal prosecutor, stepped up right beside Richard. He flipped open his gold federal badge, letting it catch the bright hospital lights. Gregory informed the state worker that the federal government was actively preparing to completely expunge my local arrest record, as I was officially classified as a highly protected material witness who had directly assisted in preventing a federal homicide cover-up. He demanded she stand down and release the child into my custody immediately. But the state worker did not flinch. She looked at the gold badge and shook her head with infuriating, rigid, bureaucratic stubbornness. She stated clearly that federal prosecutors do not dictate state child placement policy until a state family court judge officially dissolved the restraining order and completely cleared my criminal background check. Her hands were legally tied. The hospital protocol required her to remove the child the second he was medically cleared for discharge. Richard cursed loudly, his face turning red with absolute frustration. The law was a massive blind machine, and it was currently crushing us under its heavy iron gears. We needed a judge to sign an emergency override tonight, but the family courts had been completely evacuated and shut down due to the fire Bradley had started in the chambers. The entire building was currently an active federal crime scene. There were no judges sitting at any bench in the entire city to hear our emergency appeal. We were trapped in a horrific legal limbo, watching the clock tick down as the medical staff prepared my grandson for state removal. Richard pulled out his heavy burner phone and began pacing the sterile hallway. He was frantically calling every single judicial contact he had ever made in his 30-year career, desperately searching for a magistrate willing to sign an emergency stay of placement from their living room. We had to keep Leo inside the hospital overnight to buy enough time to clear my name. While Richard fought a losing battle on the phone, the state worker received a sudden incoming call on her own mobile device. She stepped away to listen, her severe expression shifting into a tight professional nod. She wrote something down on her thick clipboard, ended the call, and walked directly back to me. She announced that the foster care placement was no longer necessary. My heart leaped with a brief second of pure hope, but it was instantly crushed by her very next sentence. She stated that an immediate relative with an absolutely spotless criminal record had just filed an emergency petition for temporary guardianship, and the state was officially approving the immediate transfer. I asked her exactly who she was talking about. She coldly informed me that Vanessa, desperate to secure a lenient plea deal from the federal authorities and prove her cooperative nature, had called her older sister. Vanessa's sister was a wealthy, clean-record citizen who lived 3 states away. She had formally claimed that Bradley had manipulated her entire family, and she was stepping in to rescue the child from the chaotic fallout. She was currently driving to the hospital with approved state paperwork to legally claim Leo. The parasite's mistress, the very woman who had spent my stolen money on Italian leather sofas while my daughter died, was now using her own family to steal my grandson right out from under the law. We had burned Bradley's empire to the ground, but his toxic roots were still trying to strangle the last living piece of my family. I looked at Richard. The financial war was over, but a completely new, terrifying legal bloodbath had just begun. The automatic sliding glass doors of the emergency room hissed open with a sharp mechanical sound, cutting through the tense silence of the hospital waiting area. A tall, sharply dressed white woman walked into the glaring fluorescent light. She looked remarkably like Vanessa, sharing the same sharp jawline and cold eyes, but her appearance was meticulously polished to project an aura of conservative generational wealth. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, expensive leather boots, and carried a thick manila folder completely stuffed with notarized legal documents. She did not look around the room with the frantic concern of a worried family member rushing to a medical emergency. She scanned the hospital lobby with the cold, calculating efficiency of a corporate auditor arriving to collect a debt. The Child Protective Services worker immediately stepped forward to greet her, extending a warm, professional handshake that completely contrasted with the robotic disdain she had shown me. The woman introduced herself as Vanessa's older sister. She handed the thick folder directly to the state worker, loudly declaring that her private family attorney had successfully expedited the emergency guardianship transfer through a sympathetic county judge just 30 minutes ago. She stated that she was there to immediately take physical custody of Leo and drive him back to her gated estate 3 states away. I stood up from my plastic chair, my heavy work boots feeling like they were cast in solid lead. I had shattered a locked oak door with my bare hands to pull my grandson out of a burning room, and now this absolute stranger was walking in to simply collect him like a piece of abandoned luggage. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The 2 hospital security guards instantly tensed, stepping in front of the woman to physically block my path. I looked over their shoulders directly into her cold eyes. I told her she had absolutely no right to take my grandson. I told her that her sister had eagerly spent my stolen life savings while my daughter died in agony, and I would rather burn the entire hospital to the ground than let another branch of that poisonous family tree touch my bloodline. The woman did not look intimidated. She offered a thin, incredibly condescending smile. She looked at my soot-stained canvas coat, my bruised face, and the thick, bloody bandage wrapped tightly around my left arm. She spoke to me with the slow, exaggerated articulation one might use to address a confused vagrant. She stated that the state of the law did not care about my dramatic personal feelings. She pointed to her legal paperwork declaring that the state had officially deemed me a violent, unstable criminal entirely unfit to raise a child. She told me to step back and let the civilized adults handle the situation, or she would have me arrested for harassment right there in the hospital lobby. The state worker enthusiastically agreed with her, stamping the final discharge papers on her thick clipboard. The heavy wooden doors of the trauma bay swung open. A tired pediatric nurse wheeled Leo out into the hallway. My grandson looked incredibly small and fragile in the oversized hospital wheelchair. He was wearing a faded hospital gown, clutching a thin white blanket to his chest, his face still pale from the severe chemical smoke inhalation. When he saw me standing across the room, his eyes welled up with heavy tears. He weakly called out for me, reaching his small hand in my direction. The sheer, overwhelming agony of hearing his fragile voice break shattered whatever remaining patience I possessed. I took another massive step forward, completely prepared to fight the security guards, the state worker, and anyone else who stood in my way. But before I could raise my hands, Richard grabbed my shoulder with an iron grip, violently pulling me back. He told me to stop immediately. He warned me that if I threw a single punch in this lobby, I would give them the exact legal ammunition they needed to lock me away for the rest of my life. Richard stepped past me, his soot-stained suit looking entirely battered, but his eyes burning with the fierce, predatory intellect of a veteran trial lawyer. Richard walked right up to the state worker and snatched the approved guardianship petition directly from her clipboard. The woman gasped in outrage, demanding he return the state property instantly. Richard ignored her completely. He flipped rapidly through the thick pages, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs with blinding speed. He stopped on the third page, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his exhausted face. He turned to the federal prosecutor, Gregory, who was standing quietly near the vending machines watching the entire exchange. Richard pointed a stained finger at the document. He announced loudly to the entire lobby that Vanessa's sister had made a catastrophic, arrogant mistake on her expedited legal forms. To fast-track the emergency custody approval, her private attorney had officially listed Vanessa as the primary character reference and the immediate point of contact, verifying the child's familial situation. Richard handed the document to Gregory. He stated that the legal petition heavily relied on the sworn testimony of a woman who was currently sitting in a federal interrogation room, fully confessing to her active role in a massive interstate wire fraud and homicide conspiracy. Gregory took the document, his sharp eyes narrowing as he read the signature. The federal prosecutor stepped forward, his heavy tactical boots sounding like hammer strikes against the linoleum floor. He did not introduce himself politely. He held up his gold federal badge directly in front of the sister's face. He informed her that the sworn affidavit she had used to secure the state custody order was legally defined as federal perjury because it willfully concealed her sister's active federal indictment. The woman's arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden flash of nervous panic. She stammered, claiming she had absolutely no knowledge of any criminal charges. Gregory cut her off with a voice that carried the absolute weight of the United States government. He stated that federal jurisdiction officially overrides state family court mandates in matters involving active terrorism, massive interstate fraud, and the federal protection of primary witnesses. Gregory looked at the terrified state worker. He announced that because Leo was actively held hostage at knife point in a federal building and nearly murdered in an arson attempt designed to destroy federal evidence, the child was now officially classified as a highly protected material witness in a massive federal homicide investigation. Gregory turned his intense gaze back to Vanessa's sister. He told her that if she attempted to remove a protected federal witness from the hospital, he would immediately arrest her for active obstruction of justice, federal kidnapping, and conspiracy to conceal evidence. He promised her he would seize her gated estate, freeze her pristine bank accounts, and lock her in a federal penitentiary next to her sister before the sun came up. The woman physically recoiled, her face draining of all color. The polished facade of generational wealth completely crumbled under the terrifying threat of federal annihilation. She did not argue. She did not threaten to call her expensive lawyers. She snatched her designer handbag from the counter, turned on her leather boots, and practically ran out of the sliding glass doors into the cold night. The state worker stood entirely frozen in shock, her silver pen shaking violently in her hand. Gregory reached over, took the state discharge papers from her clipboard, and ripped them perfectly in half. He announced that under the authority of the Victim and Witness Protection Act, he was officially designating me, Maurice, as the temporary federal custodian of the child, completely voiding the fraudulent state restraining order. He ordered the security guards to step aside. I walked across the sterile lobby, fell to my ruined knees beside the wheelchair, and wrapped my heavy arms entirely around my weeping grandson. The legal war was finally over. The parasite was dead, the roots were completely severed, and my bloodline was entirely safe in my arms. 1 entire year passed before I saw Bradley Foster again. The passage of time had allowed the physical burns on my arm to scar over smoothly, and the thick, toxic smoke had finally cleared from my grandson's lungs. But the wounds inflicted on our family required a much longer, quieter healing process. I sat in the front row of the massive dark wood-paneled federal courtroom wearing a clean-pressed suit. Richard sat beside me looking entirely rejuvenated, having officially regained his pristine legal reputation after delivering the largest corporate fraud conviction the state had seen in a decade. The heavy side door of the courtroom opened and two armed federal marshals escorted Bradley into the room. The sight of him was an absolute revelation. The polished, arrogant real estate executive who had sneered at me in the rain was completely gone. He was wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely on his shrinking, malnourished frame. His expensive haircut was entirely gone, replaced by a ragged, uneven buzz cut. His shoulders were permanently hunched, destroyed by the weight of his own profound failure. He looked incredibly small, weak, and utterly pathetic. The federal judge presiding over the sentencing did not mince words. She looked down at Bradley with absolute judicial disgust. She meticulously recounted his crimes for the official public record. She detailed how he had systematically poisoned a loving mother, forged commercial real estate deeds, stolen an old man's entire life savings, and held an innocent child at knife point inside a burning building. When she asked if he had any final words before sentencing, Bradley turned around and looked directly at me. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with desperate, begging tears. He opened his mouth trying to offer some hollow, pathetic apology to save himself. I did not give him the satisfaction of an angry reaction. I did not sneer or smile. I simply looked back at him with a face carved from absolute unyielding stone. I gave him nothing. The judge struck her heavy wooden gavel. She sentenced Bradley Foster to 25 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. He would be an old, broken man before he ever saw the sun without razor wire blocking his view. As the marshals dragged him away, he began to sob uncontrollably, the sound echoing miserably off the courtroom walls. Vanessa had already been sentenced to 5 years in a medium security facility, her glamorous life completely reduced to a narrow concrete cell. The predators had been entirely devoured by the consequences of their own ravenous greed. The silent adjustment had fully restored the balance of the world. Through Richard's meticulous legal maneuvering, Obsidian Holdings, the fake corporate entity we had created, successfully absorbed the massive commercial property Bradley had attempted to buy. We liquidated the assets, completely paying off the bank loans and recovering every single stolen dollar. The $80,000 he had drained from my retirement account was fully restored secure in a trust fund established entirely in Leo's name. But more importantly, the 2-story brick house I had built with my own bare hands legally returned to my absolute possession. The fraudulent deed transfers were completely expunged from the county records. I stood on the front porch of that brick house on a warm, clear Sunday afternoon. The smell of fresh-cut grass filled the air. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing watching Leo run across the green lawn. He was laughing brightly, chasing a yellow tennis ball our new rescue dog had just stolen from him. He had grown taller, his shoulders broader, his spirit entirely uncrushed by the darkness he had survived. The nightmares that had plagued him for the first few months had slowly faded away, replaced by the simple, profound joy of a safe childhood. I looked up at the old oak tree casting a long, protective shadow over the yard. The wooden treehouse I had built years ago was completely refurbished, structurally reinforced with new steel brackets and fresh mahogany planks. I had spent the entire spring repairing the foundation of the house, fixing the broken drywall, and completely erasing every single physical trace Bradley and Vanessa had left behind. I thought deeply about Camille as I watched her son play in the sunlight. The pain of losing her will never truly vanish. It is a heavy stone I will carry in my chest until the day I finally close my eyes. But the sharp, agonizing edge of that grief has been replaced by a quiet, enduring purpose. I learned that the blood running through your veins does not automatically grant someone the right to your loyalty, your resources, or your home. True family is built entirely on a foundation of absolute respect, unwavering truth, and unconditional protection. When a parasite attaches itself to your life, hoping to drain you of your strength and discard your empty shell, you cannot simply reason with it. You cannot cry, and you cannot beg for mercy from a creature that lacks a soul. You must remain entirely silent, gather your tools, and systematically dismantle the ground they stand on. You must force them to fall on their own sword. I am Maurice. I am 70 years old. I lost my daughter to a monster, but I tore down an entire empire to save my grandson. I rebuilt my life from the ashes using nothing but absolute patience and cold concrete. If you are watching this and you are currently bleeding from the wounds inflicted by the very people who claim to love you, know that your silence is not a weakness. It is simply the quiet sound of a deadly trap being set. Thank you for listening to my story. Please subscribe, leave a comment below, and never forget that a quiet man pushed to his absolute limit is the most dangerous force on earth. I also learned that the most dangerous threats do not break your windows in the middle of the night. They walk right through your front door wearing a warm smile and a tailored suit. We spend our entire lives building physical fortresses out of brick and concrete to protect our loved ones from the harsh world outside. But a physical fortress is entirely useless if you willingly hand the keys to a parasite. You must guard your trust as fiercely as you guard your bank account. True protection requires constant vigilance and the absolute willingness to see people exactly as they are, not as you desperately wish them to be. Share this video with anyone who needs the strength to stand up to toxic family members, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute resilience.